Just said he proposed to his mistress using her dead grandmother's ring in front of 500 witnesses and never expected her to walk through that door. But Isabella Hart didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just asked one question that stopped the music, stopped the applause, stopped the breathing of every powerful man in that room. And nothing was ever the same again. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because the stories I tell on this channel do not hold back. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted with everything, hit that like button. This one's for you. Now let's get into it. PA. The lamb had been braising for 4 hours. Isabella knew because she'd checked the clock exactly 4 times. 2:47, 3:15, 3:52, and now 4:30. Each glance punctuated by the kind of quiet hopefulness she'd trained herself to feel only in small doses. Hope, in the Moretti household, had a habit of curdling if you let too much of it pool in one place. She moved through the kitchen with practiced precision, adjusting the burner, tasting the sauce from a wooden spoon, pressing her thumb absently against the worn edge of the counter where the marble had chipped 3 winters ago. She'd meant to have it replaced. Somehow, it never happened. There was always something more urgent, a business trip that extended without explanation, a dinner she wasn't invited to, a phone call Adrian took in another room with the door not quite closed but closed enough. The kitchen smelled like rosemary and red wine and something that felt dangerously close to a normal life. She'd arranged the table herself. No staff, no ceremony, just 2 plates, 2 candles, a bottle of Barolo she'd been saving since their 5th anniversary. And at the center, wrapped in the same worn velvet pouch her grandmother had pressed into her hands the night before she died, the ring. Her grandmother's ring, not a diamond, not a stone worth anything to the kind of people who moved in the Moretti world, where women wore jewelry the way generals wore medals. For show, for intimidation, for proof that someone powerful had claimed them. This ring was a simple gold band with a tiny engraved cluster of olive branches, the metal worn thin in the places where her grandmother's fingers had rubbed it smooth over 63 years of marriage. It was worth nothing to anyone alive except Isabella, and she'd kept it in a lockbox in her dressing room since the funeral, too afraid even to wear it. Tonight she'd taken it out because tonight she was going to tell Adrian she was ready. Ready to stop pretending their marriage was just a business arrangement. Ready to stop sleeping in separate wings of a house that echoed. Ready to stop swallowing what she wanted because what she wanted had never quite made it onto his list of priorities. She was going to tell him she wanted a child. She was going to put the ring on the table between them and say, "This is what family means to me, and I want to build one with you." Still, despite everything, she was 37 years old and tired of being the most overlooked woman in a mansion full of security cameras. She wiped her hands on a dish towel, straightened the candles one more time, and went upstairs to change. The dressing room was the one space in the house that felt entirely hers. Not because Adrian had given it to her, but because he'd never once set foot in it. The closet, the vanity, the lockbox bolted to the interior shelf where she kept the documents and photographs and small objects that mattered to her in a way she couldn't explain to a man whose sense of value had been calibrated entirely in dollars and loyalty oaths. The lockbox was open, not broken open, not forced, just open. The combination dial resting at 0, the way it sat after someone had deliberately reset it. Her hands went cold before her brain caught up. She stood there for a long moment, the hum of the ventilation system filling the silence, and then she looked inside. The ring was gone. The velvet pouch was gone. A small photograph of her grandmother at her own wedding, tucked behind the ring box for years, was still there, which told her whoever had taken it knew exactly what they were looking for and hadn't bothered with anything else. She sat down on the edge of the velvet bench in front of the vanity and breathed through her nose, the way her therapist had taught her during the years she'd been quietly attending sessions across town under a different name. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. Don't catastrophize. Don't assume. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. No text. Just a link to a live camera feed. She almost didn't click it. She'd received enough unsolicited messages in the past decade of married life to know that the ones from unknown numbers were either traps or warnings. And the distinction rarely mattered because both required you to make a decision before you had enough information to make it well. She clicked it anyway. The feed was grainy, but clear enough. A ballroom. The grand ballroom of the Moretti Continental, the family's flagship hotel in the center of the city, dressed in deep crimson and gold. Hundreds of guests in formal attire. Cameras she recognized as belonging to the hotel's private security system, which meant whoever sent her this link had access to the hotel's internal network. And in the center of the frame, surrounded by people she recognized, elected officials, senior crime family representatives, lawyers who appeared in court on Monday mornings and disappeared into back rooms on Friday nights, was her husband. Adrian Moretti was on one knee. He was holding a ring. Even through the low resolution of the feed, Isabella recognized it. The thin gold band, the olive branch engraving, the worn human smallness of it against his large hand. He was holding her grandmother's ring and pressing it toward the extended fingers of a woman Isabella had met exactly 6 times in 11 years of marriage. Vivian Cross, Adrian's consigliere, whose tailored suits and carefully neutral expressions had always suggested a relationship with emotion roughly equivalent to a chess player's relationship with their opponent's feelings. The applause on the feed was muffled but audible. Isabella watched Vivian extend her hand, watched the ring slide into place, watched the room erupt. She sat for 3 more seconds on that velvet bench, her hands in her lap, looking at the screen. Then she put the phone in her clutch, stood up, checked her reflection once, not for vanity, but the way a soldier checks their equipment before walking into a situation where precision is the only advantage they have, and went downstairs to get her coat. She didn't turn off the stove. The lamb could burn. The Moretti Continental was 12 minutes from the estate by car. Isabella took the service entrance, not from habit, but from intention. She knew this building the way she knew most things in her life, thoroughly, quietly, from angles that no one expected her to have studied. She had attended more events in this ballroom than she could count. Charity galas, alliance negotiations, the kind of celebrations that masqueraded as one thing in the official record and meant something else entirely in the unwritten history of the families who controlled the eastern seaboard. She knew where the cameras were mounted, which hallways fed directly into the main hall, where the kitchen staff gathered during formal events, and which of the 3 sets of service doors opened without triggering a notification to the front desk security team. She used the 3rd door. She heard the ballroom before she reached it. Not music. The music had stopped. She heard voices, the collective held breath of a crowd processing something unexpected, and then the particular frequency of several hundred people going very, very quiet all at once. She was already in the room before she'd consciously decided to enter it. The crowd parted the way crowds do when someone moves with absolute certainty and zero urgency. Not because they recognized her, but because there is a specific quality of stillness that a person carries when they have nothing left to lose, and other bodies respond to it instinctively, the way prey animals respond to a change in air pressure before a storm is visible. She saw Adrian first. He was still standing, Vivian beside him, her left hand slightly elevated the way new ring wearers unconsciously hold their hands, tilted just enough to catch light. Around them, the assembled power structure of the Moretti organization and its political adjacencies stared in a collective state of suspended animation. Adrian saw her. His face did something complicated. Not guilt, or not purely guilt, because guilt requires a prior acknowledgement of wrongness. And she understood in that instant that he had told himself a story in which what he'd done tonight was necessary, was strategic, was something she would eventually understand even if she couldn't understand it now. His face was the face of a man encountering evidence that his story had a hole in it. Vivian's expression did not change. That, more than anything, told Isabella what she needed to know. She didn't raise her voice. The room was quiet enough that she didn't have to. "Where did you get my grandmother's ring?" 7 words. She counted them afterward, in the car, on the drive home, the way you count things when your mind is trying to stay occupied and rational and far away from the feeling that is waiting underneath every surface, thought like groundwater under a drought. 7 words, and the silence they produced was total. Someone near the back coughed. A glass clinked against a table. Somewhere in the hotel's ventilation system, air moved through a duct with a low mechanical sigh. Adrian opened his mouth. She turned and walked out before a single syllable reached her. She made it to the car. She made it out of the parking structure. She drove 4 blocks and then pulled over on a side street between a dry cleaner and a shuttered shoe repair shop, put the car in park, pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, and breathed. Not crying. She wasn't crying. She was taking inventory, the way her grandfather had taught her to when she was 8 years old and had fallen from the oak tree in the backyard and landed badly. He'd crouched beside her on the grass and said, "Before you panic, check what's broken. Start at the top and work your way down. If everything moves, nothing's broken. You're just in shock." She went through it methodically. She had suspected for approximately 2 years that something in her marriage was fundamentally wrong in a way that went beyond Adrian's habitual emotional unavailability and the grinding loneliness of being married to a man whose professional world required absolute secrecy and whose personal world had slowly shrunk to the size of a room she wasn't in. She had suspected Vivian specifically for 8 months, after noticing a pattern of scheduling conflicts, a shift in the texture of Adrian's silences, and one specific moment at a dinner in October when he'd passed the salt to Vivian before she'd finished asking for it. A small thing, meaningless to anyone watching, but Isabella had been reading Adrian's reflexive behaviors for 11 years and knew that kind of anticipatory attention was not nothing. She had hoped she was wrong. She had prepared lamb and opened wine and taken out her grandmother's ring because some part of her had needed to believe, that the marriage was rescuable if she could just get him alone long enough to have an honest conversation without lieutenants and lawyers and the perpetual background hum of the organization's demands. That part of her was wrong. What she hadn't expected was the ring, that specific cruelty. Whether intentional or careless, and she didn't yet know which was worse, that was new information. It told her either that Adrian had taken the ring himself, or that someone had taken it for him, or that someone had taken it without his knowledge. Each of those possibilities had a different set of implications, and she needed to know which one was true before she did anything else. She sat up straight, wiped her face with the back of her hand. Dry, she noted with something between relief and vague surprise. She'd cried exactly once in the past 2 years, in her therapist's office after a session in which she'd finally said out loud what she'd been avoiding saying for months. 1 session's worth of tears, and then nothing, because at some point she'd learned that grief and strategy couldn't occupy the same space at the same time, and she'd chosen strategy the way you choose the option that keeps you functional. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus Webb. Marcus was 71 years old, had served as the Moretti family's attorney for 34 years, and had known Isabella's grandfather before he'd ever met Adrian's father. He was the only person in the organization's entire legal infrastructure who had ever looked at her like she was a principal rather than an accessory. She'd called him exactly twice in 11 years, once when she'd needed to understand a clause in a property transfer document, and once when she'd found something in Adrian's private files that she'd spent 8 months convincing herself she'd misread. He answered on the second ring. "Isabella, I need to see you," she said. "Tonight. Not tomorrow." A pause, long enough to tell her he'd already heard something. "Where?" "Your office. The one on Caldwell, not the firm." Another pause. She heard him exhale. Not surprise, exactly, but something adjacent to it. The sound of a man recalibrating. "How long do I have?" 20 minutes. "I'll be there in 15, he said, and hung up. She put the car in drive and thought about her grandmother, who had worn that ring for 63 years and never once taken it off voluntarily. Who had told Isabella, during the last week of her life, speaking in the particular compressed clarity of a person who has realized they are saying something for the last time. "The women in our family do not run from fire. We learn to control it." She hadn't understood it then. It had sounded like the kind of thing old women said when they wanted to seem wise. She understood it now. Marcus Webb's second office was exactly what it looked like from the outside. a narrow brownstone suite on Caldwell Street that he'd maintained for decades as a place to meet clients whose business couldn't pass through the official firm's front door without attracting the kind of attention that made everyone's lives complicated. The building smelled of old paper and the ghost of cigarettes smoked by a previous tenant sometime in the last century. He was already there when she arrived, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, his tie loosened in the particular way that suggested he'd been home when she'd called and had driven here without fully changing out of whatever evening he'd been in the middle of. He looked at her face. He didn't say, "I heard what happened." He said, "Sit down. Tell me what you need." She sat. She put her clutch on the desk between them, folded her hands, and started talking. She told him about the ring, about the lockbox, about the link, about what she'd seen on the feed, and what she'd seen in the ballroom, and the 7 words she'd said, and Adrian's face, and Vivian's face, and the drive here, and the 4 blocks she'd pulled over, and the inventory. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she'd always respected about Marcus Webb. He never rushed a person toward a conclusion he'd already formed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he took his glasses off his forehead and set them carefully on the desk and looked at her with the specific attention of someone who has information they are deciding how to give. "How much do you know," he said slowly, "about the financial restructuring Adrian initiated 14 months ago?" She had not known about a financial restructuring. The way she didn't answer told him that. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if her silence confirmed something he'd been tracking for a while. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one she'd always assumed held nothing but physical files too sensitive to be scanned, and removed a folder. Not thin. Not the kind of folder that contained a memo or two and some supporting documents. This folder was the kind that suggested someone had been accumulating material for a long time, carefully, waiting for a moment when presenting it would matter. He slid it across the desk. "Before you open that," he said, "I need you to understand something. I have been Adrian Moretti's attorney for 34 years. I have protected this family through things that would have destroyed lesser organizations. I kept my mouth shut when I should have spoken because I believed in the institution, even when I had questions about the man." He paused. "I'm telling you that so you understand what it means that I'm giving you this folder." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened it. The first page was a financial summary. A series of offshore transfers, dates, and amounts, moving through a structure of shell companies so layered that she'd need an accountant to trace the full pattern. But even without a full trace, the destination accounts were legible. She recognized 2 of the institution names from documents she'd seen in Adrian's study, documents he'd left out once, briefly, that she'd photographed without thinking too hard about why. The second page was a surveillance photograph. Vivian Cross and an elderly man she didn't recognize, seated in the outdoor section of a restaurant she identified from the awning as being in the financial district. The timestamp was 16 months ago. They were leaning toward each other over the table with the body language of people who were not having a casual lunch. The third page was a name. Just a name. Handwritten by Marcus Webb in the margin of a corporate registration document. Vincent Romano. She didn't recognize it. She looked up at Marcus. "He's no one you'd have any reason to know," Marcus said quietly. "Adrian doesn't know him either, or believes he doesn't. That's the point." She looked back at the page. The corporate registration was dated 28 years ago. The name appeared in connection with a network of holding companies that, now that she was looking, threaded through the financial summary on the first page like roots under a building's foundation. "How long have you had this?" she asked. Marcus looked at his hands. "Long enough," he said, "that I should have done something with it sooner." She closed the folder. Outside, on Caldwell Street, a cab rolled past in the rain that had started while she'd been inside. She watched it through the window. The brief smear of yellow, the hiss of tires on wet pavement, and then looked back at Marcus. "I'm going to need an accountant," she said. "Someone who knew Dominic Moretti. Someone who's been out of the organization long enough that they have nothing to protect." Marcus almost smiled, not warmly, with the specific, rueful expression of a man who has just watched someone skip several stages of grief and arrive directly at determination. "I know exactly who you're thinking of," he said. Can you get me a meeting? Give me until morning. She nodded, stood, picked up her clutch. At the door, she paused. Marcus? Yes. The ring. Do you know if Adrian knew it was mine? He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that is its own answer. She walked out into the rain. She drove home to the estate, not because she felt safe there, but because leaving would signal something, and she had no intention of signaling anything to anyone until she understood the full architecture of what she was walking into. She went upstairs to her dressing room, changed into clothes she could think in, and sat down at the small writing desk in the corner with the folder Marcus had given her and a yellow legal pad and a pen. She worked until nearly 3 a.m, building a map. Not literal, just structural, the way she'd been taught to think through complex problems by a grandmother who had believed that every situation, no matter how overwhelming, would yield to a person willing to sit still long enough to understand its shape. At some point, she heard Adrian's car on the gravel drive. She heard him come inside, heard him on the stairs, heard him pause outside the dressing room door. She didn't move. Her pen didn't stop. He knocked. She didn't answer. After a long moment, she heard him move down the hall toward the master suite. She listened to his footsteps until they faded, and then she turned back to her legal pad and wrote a single name at the top of a fresh page in letters large enough to see from a distance. Vincent Romano. She underlined it twice. She didn't know yet who he was. She didn't know what he'd built or how long he'd been building it or what he stood to gain from everything she'd watched unravel tonight in that ballroom. But she knew, with the particular cold certainty that comes from having spent a decade married to one of the most dangerous men in the country and learning quietly and without any formal instruction how power actually moved, she knew that whatever name was at the top of this structure was the name that mattered. And she was going to find him. The lamb had burned. The wine was still on the table. The 2 candles had melted down to nothing while she'd been driving in the rain. In the morning, she would call Marcus. She would meet whoever he arranged. She would begin pulling the thread. And she would do it the way she'd done everything for 11 years in this marriage, without anyone in the building knowing exactly how much she understood. But tonight, for exactly 4 more minutes, because she'd promised herself no more than 4, she pressed her palm flat against the page where she'd written his name and let herself feel the full weight of what it meant that someone had taken her grandmother's ring. Not the betrayal of the marriage, not even the public humiliation of the ballroom. The ring. 63 years on her grandmother's hand, and whoever was behind this had used it as a prop, a piece of staging, something borrowed for an effect. The specific contempt of that, the assumption that Isabella Hart was someone whose most sacred objects could be appropriated without consequence. That contempt was the thing she was going to use, because contempt makes people careless, and careful people, she had learned, could do extraordinary damage to careless ones. She capped her pen, closed the folder, and sat very still in the dark of the dressing room while the rest of the house slept, thinking about a man named Vincent Romano and what he might have assumed about a woman he'd never once considered a threat. He was about to learn the cost of that assumption, but he didn't know it yet, and neither, not entirely, did she. She slept for 90 minutes, not because she meant to. She'd been sitting at the writing desk with her eyes open, running names and numbers through her head the way you run a tongue over a cracked tooth, compulsively, mapping the damage. And then at some point the yellow legal pad had blurred and she'd gone under without warning, her cheek against the back of her hand, the pen still loosely capped in her fingers. She woke at 4:47 a.m. to the sound of Adrian's voice somewhere below her. Not shouting. Adrian never shouted. It was one of the things people who didn't know him misunderstood about him. The men who shouted were the ones compensating for something. Adrian spoke at normal volume, regardless of what he was saying, and the people around him had learned that the quieter he got, the more dangerous the sentence. She lay still for a moment, listening, parsing the rhythm of it through 2 floors of plaster and hardwood. He was on the phone. She rose carefully, moved to the dressing room door, pressed it open a half inch, and listened. Told you she'd be handled. A pause. I said I would handle it. Another pause, longer. Vivian, I don't need you to manage this. I need you to trust that I know my own house. She closed the door, stood with her back against it in the dark, her bare feet on the cold floor, and absorbed the specific information contained in those 3 sentences. He was reassuring Vivian, which meant Vivian was not reassured, which meant Vivian was either genuinely anxious about Isabella's reaction or, and this was the possibility that sat heavier, Vivian was establishing a record of having raised the concern in case it became relevant later. She went back to the desk. She added a line to the legal pad. V. Managing narrative. Who does the record serve? At 6:15, Marcus Webb texted a single address and a time, 9 a.m. She recognized the cross streets, a neighborhood on the east side, residential, the kind of blocks where the houses had been occupied by the same families for 40 years. And nobody asked questions about visitors because everybody understood that some people received visitors who needed not to be remembered. She showered, dressed in something unremarkable, dark slacks, a gray wool sweater, flat shoes, nothing that would require a second glance, and went downstairs. Adrian was in the kitchen. He was standing at the counter with a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk, still in yesterday's shirt, his jacket draped over one of the bar stools with the careful carelessness of a man who'd placed it there to look like he hadn't thought about it. He looked, she thought, like someone who'd rehearsed a version of this morning and was now discovering that the actual morning was not cooperating with the rehearsal. He looked at her when she came in. She went to the cabinet, took out a cup, filled it from the pot without looking at him. Isabella. I have an appointment, she said. We need to talk. Yes. She picked up the cup. We do, but not this morning. She heard him set down his own cup. I know how that looked. She turned. She looked at him for the first time since the ballroom. Really looked, the way you look at a landscape after a storm, assessing what's been altered. He was 44 years old and looked, this morning, every year of it. There were lines around his eyes she didn't remember being so deep. His jaw was unshaved in the way that telegraphed a night without sleep rather than a deliberate choice. He looked guilty. But guilty, she had learned in 11 years, was not the same as honest. The ring, Adrian. He flinched, one small, involuntary contraction around the eyes. I can explain that. I'm sure you believe that. It wasn't... He stopped, started again. It wasn't what it looked like. What did it look like? He opened his mouth, closed it. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. I'll be back this afternoon, she said. She walked past him, picked up her coat from the rack by the side door, and left. She sat in her car for 30 seconds in the driveway, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. Through the kitchen window, she could see him still standing at the counter, not moving. She put the car in reverse and backed down the drive. The address Marcus had given her was a narrow row house on Pelham Street, with a concrete stoop and window boxes that had been planted with something evergreen, specifically because evergreen things required the least amount of attention. She rang the bell at 8:57 and waited, watching a sparrow work its way along the gutter across the street. The man who opened the door was small, mid-70s, with the particular posture of someone who had once been broader and had diminished not from weakness, but from a long, deliberate process of making himself less visible. His name, Marcus had told her in a follow-up text, was Ellis Carver. He had served as the Moretti organization's senior accountant for 19 years under Dominic Moretti, Adrian's father. He had retired, quietly, at his own initiative, 3 years before Dominic's death, and had not, as far as anyone in the organization was aware, retained copies of anything. As far as anyone in the organization was aware, was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. He looked at her face, the way old men who've spent their lives reading numbers look at things, for a long moment, assessing value and risk with no particular expression. You look like your grandfather, he said. She blinked. You knew my grandfather? Not well. Once. He stepped back from the door. Come in. The inside of the house smelled like coffee and old newspapers and the particular dusty warmth of a home where someone had lived alone for a long time and had made peace with it. He led her through a narrow hall to a back room that served as either a study or a storage facility, depending on how generously you defined the term. Stacked along one wall were banker's boxes, each labeled in small, neat handwriting. Along the opposite wall, a desk with a proper accountant's lamp and a surface currently occupied by 3 separate stacks of documents that appeared to have been pulled recently. He'd been expecting her before Marcus had called. She sat in the chair across from the desk. He settled into his own with the careful management of someone whose hips were providing a running commentary on the morning's activities. "Marcus told you why I'm here," she said. "Marcus told me enough." He folded his hands on the desk. "The rest I figured out myself when I read about the engagement on The Wire this morning." She paused. "It's already on The Wire?" "It was on The Wire at midnight." He watched her absorb that. "Somebody wanted that announcement distributed. Fast, that's not Adrian Moretti's style. He doesn't publicize personal decisions. It creates leverage points. Someone else pushed that out." She thought about Vivian on the phone at 4 a.m. about the record. Who has access to The Wire? "That depends which wire you mean." He reached for the first stack of documents without appearing to hurry. "There's the official family communication channel, which Adrian controls through his senior lieutenants. And then there's the secondary network, which has been running parallel to the official one for approximately—" He checked a date on the top sheet without seeming to need to, the way people recall things they've looked at so many times. The information is more reflex than memory. 14 months. 14 months again. The same interval Marcus had mentioned. "Tell me about the restructuring," she said. He looked at her for a moment, not with surprise, but with the recalibrated attention of someone who has just confirmed an estimate. "Adrian told you about it." "Adrian told me nothing about it, but I've been married to him for 11 years, and people who manage large amounts of money leave traces whether they intend to or not. And I know what his financial activity looks like when it's normal, so I know what it looked like when it changed." Ellis Carver was quiet for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition, the way you look at a stranger and realize they speak your language. "The restructuring," he said, "moved approximately $240 million across a series of asset transfers that, on paper, look like routine diversification into legitimate commercial holdings. Hotels, logistics companies, a small regional bank in the Carolinas." He paused. "Except the beneficial ownership structures on those holding entities don't trace back to the Moretti family. They trace back to a layered network of trusts and corporations that lead, if you follow them carefully enough and know what to look for, to a man named Vincent Romano." She had the folder from Marcus in her bag. She didn't take it out. "Who is he?" "He's 73 years old. He built the Romano organization out of the Carolinas and Virginia in the early 90s, after the old Atlantic Coast structure collapsed. He's never been indicted, not for lack of trying, but because he's been very careful about what he touches directly and very patient about how he moves." Ellis paused. "He's also the man your grandfather refused to go into business with in 1997. She went very still. "My grandfather." "Frank Caruso." He said the name plainly, without ceremony. "He held the position in this city that Adrian now holds. He was approached by Romano in '97 with a proposal for a consolidated East Coast operation, Romano's network, and the Moretti allied families under one structure with Romano at the top. Your grandfather declined. He died 18 months later." The hairs on her forearms rose beneath her sweater. "He died of a heart attack." Ellis's expression didn't move. "Yes," he said. "He did." She breathed through it. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. And Adrian doesn't know any of this. Adrian knows Romano exists in the abstract, as an aging peer who's largely retired from active operations. That's what he's been led to believe. Ellis pulled a second sheet from the stack. What he doesn't know is that Vivian Cross has been in Romano's employment, indirect, contractual, funded through 3 layers of corporate structure, for 8 years. She was placed inside the Moretti organization 6 years ago, at Romano's direction, through a referral chain that made her appear to come from a trusted allied family. 8 years, 6 years. The math of it, the patience of it, settled over Isabella like a cold weight. "He's been building this for 30 years, she said. It wasn't a question. "Since your grandfather told him no." Ellis set down the sheet. "Romano doesn't forget, and he doesn't improvise. He builds. He waits. He lets other people make the mistakes, and he positions himself to benefit from the fallout." He paused. Destroying the Moretti bloodline from within wasn't a plan of convenience. It was the plan. Everything else, the financial diversification, Vivian, the alliance negotiations Adrian's been pursuing, it's all downstream of that original objective. She looked at the banker's boxes along the wall. How much of this do you have documented? Enough to take to federal investigators. The phrase landed in the room with the weight of something that cannot be unsaid. She looked at him. That's what you've been waiting for. He didn't flinch from it. I've been waiting for someone inside who wanted the same thing I want. Which is? To burn it down properly, he said. Not half measures. Not relocation and a new operation in a different city. Completely, legally, and in a way that takes Romano down with it and keeps the people on the periphery, the people who worked for wages and didn't know what they were working for, keeps them from being caught in the net. She thought about the kitchen staff at the Continental, the drivers, the hotel employees who'd applauded last night at a proposal they had no context for and would have no way of knowing they were participating in a crime. There's a federal prosecutor, she said slowly. Margaret Hoyle, Eastern District. She's been building a RICO case against the Romano organization for 2 years and has hit walls at every turn because Romano is structured to be unreachable from the outside. Ellis paused. She needs an inside source with documentation and access. She's been looking in the wrong direction. Isabella put her palms flat on her thighs and breathed. The distance between the woman who had put lamb in a braising pot yesterday afternoon and the woman sitting in this room right now felt, in this moment, like something measured not in hours but in tectonic shifts. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a change in altitude, not dramatically, just as a slight pressure change in everything, a recalibration of what the air costs to breathe. I need time, she said. Before I go to Hoyle, if I go to Hoyle, I need to understand the full structure. Everything Romano has built inside the organization, every captain who's been turned, every account that's been diverted, every document that's been forged. She paused. And I need to know about Adrian. Ellis was quiet. If he's been manipulated, she said, then the documentation will show it. The timeline of his decisions relative to Vivian's involvement, the pattern of advice he was receiving, the moments where his behavior changed. She looked at Ellis directly. I need to know if he knew what he was doing or if he was led there. Why does that matter to what you're building? Because it matters to me, she said. That's enough reason. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, opened the bottom drawer of his desk, and removed a portable hard drive. This is a copy, he said. Encrypted. The key is in an envelope I'll give Marcus. He slid it across the desk. Don't take it home. She looked at it. Where should I take it? Somewhere you control entirely and Adrian doesn't know about. She thought for a moment, then she put the drive in her bag. I'll need an accountant working with me directly. Not just documents. Someone who can explain what I'm looking at in real time as I go deeper. He almost smiled. I'm not as retired as people think. No, she said. I gathered that. She was back at the estate by 1 in the afternoon. The burned lamb had been cleared from the oven. By staff, she assumed, because Adrian wouldn't have thought of it. And the kitchen had been cleaned with the particular thoroughness of people trying to eliminate evidence of an uncomfortable evening. The Barolo was gone from the table. The plates. The candles. The table looked like no one had ever meant anything at it. She was hanging her coat when she heard voices from the study. Not just Adrian. Another voice, male, younger, with the flat effect of someone who had learned to deliver bad news without inflection, because inflection was a vulnerability. She recognized the voice after a moment. Danny Rowe, Adrian's head of security. 29 years old, former military, loyal to Adrian the way a well-trained dog is loyal, completely and without the capacity to question the direction of the loyalty. She moved to the hallway, stopped outside the study door, and listened. Cameras in the hotel's secondary network were accessed from an external IP, Danny was saying. Whoever sent the feed to her phone had access to the Continental's internal system. Who has that access? 6 people, all of them inside the organization. A pause. Give me the list. I already ran it. 2 of the 6 were confirmed at other locations during the window when the access happened. That leaves 4. Another pause. One of them is Marcus Webb. Silence. Isabella counted the seconds. 3, 4, 5. Marcus has had access to the Continental's system since the building was acquired, Adrian said. His voice was carefully neutral. That's not evidence of anything. No, but he was also seen entering his Caldwell Street office last night at approximately 10:45 p.m. Another silence. Longer this time. Who was with him? Isabella pressed herself against the wall, her heartbeat very loud in her own ears. Unclear, Danny said. Whoever it was went in through the building's rear entrance. Camera on that side has been malfunctioning for 2 weeks. IT logged a repair ticket, but it hasn't been serviced. Find out who it was. Already working it. She heard movement inside, the sound of Adrian coming around the desk, pacing, which he did when he was thinking hard and didn't want to be seen doing it. The accountant, he said then, and the specific flatness with which he said it told her he'd arrived somewhere. Ellis Carver. She stopped breathing. What about him? Danny said. Has anyone been in contact with him recently? Checked on him? Not that I know of. He's been off the radar for 3 years. Put someone on him. A beat. Quietly. She heard Danny's footsteps toward the door and moved fast, back down the hallway, into the kitchen, where she stood at the counter with a glass of water she'd poured without knowing she'd picked up the glass, staring at the surface of it while she heard Danny's footsteps pass the kitchen door and continue toward the front of the house. 3 minutes. She had at most 3 minutes before Danny put someone on Pelham Street, and Ellis Carver's row house with its evergreen window boxes and its banker's boxes of documentation would have a pair of eyes on it before dark. She put down the glass, took out her phone, and called Marcus. He answered immediately. They're moving on Ellis, she said without preamble. Today. You need to get him out of that house, and everything in it needs to be moved. Now. A pause so brief it was almost not there. How long do I have? Minutes, not hours. Right. His voice shifted. The lawyer's precision giving way to something older and more operational, the register of a man who had navigated genuine emergencies before the law had been his primary tool. The drive. I have it. I'll keep it. Get Ellis somewhere clean. There's a place in Ardmore. He knows it. We've discussed it. Marcus paused. Isabella. When Danny reports back to Adrian that he can't find Carver, Adrian is going to know that someone tipped you off. He's going to know you were listening. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. I know. That changes your timeline. I know, Marcus. Once he knows you're actively... Marcus. She opened her eyes. I know what it changes. Get Ellis out. She hung up, set the phone face down on the counter, picked up the water glass again and stood very still, listening to the house around her. The low hum of the climate control. A door somewhere upstairs. The distant sound of Adrian's voice starting up again on the phone in the study. She thought about the ring. She kept coming back to it, the way you keep coming back to a detail in a story that doesn't quite add up. Adrian had taken it, or had it taken, from a locked box in her dressing room. The combination to that box was known to exactly 2 people, herself and the locksmith who'd installed it 8 years ago and whose business had closed 4 years ago when he'd retired and moved to another state, which meant someone had either cracked the box or had watched her enter the combination. She thought about the camera malfunction on the rear wall of Marcus's building, the repair ticket 2 weeks old. She thought about Danny Rowe, 29 years old, former military, loyal. She thought about how long ago 14 months really was, and what a careful person could learn in 14 months about the interior layout of a household, the combination to a lockbox, the location of a rear entrance camera, if they were patient enough and close enough and trusted enough not to be questioned. She turned and looked at the kitchen doorway. The hallway beyond it was empty. She picked up her phone and opened the notes application. She typed 3 characters, a code she and Marcus had established years ago during one of their 2 previous conversations, in the offhand way that people who operate near the edges of dangerous situations sometimes establish contingencies without either party acknowledging why, and sent it to Marcus as a text. Then she pocketed the phone, straightened her sweater, and walked down the hallway to the study door. She knocked. Come in, Adrian said. She opened the door. He was alone now, behind the desk, his jacket back on in the way of a man reassembling his armor. He looked at her when she entered with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not guilt this time, but something more complicated, more layered. He was recalculating her, she realized. The way you recalculate a variable when you discover it isn't behaving the way your equation assumed it would. She sat down across from him. The desk between them was, as always, very clean. Adrian believed in a clear desk the way other people believed in clear conscience, as evidence of control. You wanted to talk, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Where were you this morning? I had an appointment. With whom? She met his eyes. A friend. Something moved across his face, not anger but the immediate precursor to it, the tightening around the jaw, the slight flare of the nostril. She watched him manage it back down. Isabella, given everything, she said, I think I'm entitled to spend a morning with a friend without reporting my itinerary. That's not what I'm saying. Then what are you saying, Adrian? She kept her voice even, not cold. She didn't want cold. Cold would tell him too much. She wanted measured. She wanted the register of a woman who is hurt and contained and has not yet decided her next move. Because from where I'm sitting, what happened last night was my husband proposing to another woman in public using my grandmother's ring. So I'm genuinely interested in what you're saying. He pressed his lips together. The ring was a mistake. A mistake? I never meant for... He stopped, pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. Vivian asked me to make a gesture, something public. I wasn't thinking clearly about what I was using. You weren't thinking clearly, she repeated. No. When did you go into my lockbox, Adrian? The silence that followed was approximately 3 seconds long and contained, she thought, more information than anything he'd said in the previous 4 minutes. I didn't go into your lockbox, he said. She studied him. She was very good at reading people who had long practice at being unreadable, because you spent enough years in proximity to a person and you learned not the tells that amateurs looked for, the eye movement, the shifted weight, but the deeper patterns, the specific way a person's breathing changed when they were telling the truth versus the specific way it didn't change when they were lying because they'd trained themselves to manage it. His breathing had not changed. He was either telling the truth or he was so accomplished a liar that the distinction was academic. Then who did? She said. He didn't answer immediately, which told her something. Adrian? Who went into my dressing room and took my grandmother's ring? He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before in 11 years. Not guilt, not calculation, not the carefully managed blankness he deployed in professional situations. Something rawer than any of those. Something that looked, and she didn't know what to do with this, like fear. Not of her. Fear of the answer. I need you to trust me, he said quietly. She laughed. It came out before she could manage it. Not a mean laugh, not theatrical, just the involuntary sound a person makes when the gap between what they're being asked and what they're standing inside becomes too wide to cross with a straight face. Adrian, she stood up. Whoever told you that was a reasonable thing to say right now was not helping you. She walked to the door. Isabella. His voice had a quality she'd never heard in it before, stripped of the authority, the deliberate calm, the weight that usually accompanied his use of her name. Just her name. Just 2 syllables, almost unprotected. She stopped with her hand on the doorframe, didn't turn around. Don't do anything, he said. Not yet, please. She stood there for a long moment. She could feel the drive in her bag, the weight of it against her hip, the shape of what she was already doing, already too far into to step back from even if she'd wanted to. She didn't respond. She walked up the stairs to her dressing room, closed the door, and sat down at the writing desk. She opened the legal pad to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Then she wrote, He doesn't know who took it. He suspects. He's afraid of what confirming it will mean. She underlined, afraid. Then she wrote, Danny Rowe. Access. 14 months. She looked at what she'd written for a long moment. Then she picked up the phone and called a number she had memorized from a business card that she had never actually received through official channels. that had come to her instead through a mutual contact 3 years ago with the specific notation that the number was available if she ever found herself in a situation where what she knew was more valuable than what she could prove. And the situation had finally found her. The phone rang twice. A woman answered. Professional, neutral, with the specific economy of someone who received calls of this nature regularly. Margaret Hoyle's office. Isabella looked at the legal pad, at the name at the top of the page underlined twice, at the architecture she'd been building since 3 a.m. Not out of revenge, she told herself, and almost believed it, and then corrected herself, because honesty in private was the only luxury she had left. Not only out of revenge, but out of the particular anger of a woman who has been patient for too long with people who mistook patience for weakness. "My name is Isabella Moretti," she said. "I have documentation relating to an ongoing federal investigation. I'd like to arrange a meeting with the prosecutor directly." A brief pause, then, "Can you hold for one moment?" "Yes," Isabella said. She held. Downstairs, she heard Adrian's footsteps in the study, back and forth, the same pacing rhythm she'd heard through the floor. The sound of a man who had just realized that the situation had moved outside the boundaries of his control and wasn't sure yet how far outside it had gone. He had no idea. The hold music clicked off. "Miss Moretti." A new voice, sharper, more direct, the register of someone who had just been handed something unexpected and was already processing what to do with it. "This is Margaret Hoyle. I'm told you have documentation." "I do," Isabella said. "How substantial?" "Enough to give you Vincent Romano," she said. "All of it. The full structure. The inside source, the financial records, the surveillance, the chain of custody back to the original." She paused because the next word cost her something, and she paid it anyway. "Back to the original manipulation of my husband." Silence on the line. 3 full seconds of it. "Where are you right now?" Hoyle asked. "At home." She looked at the closed door of the dressing room. "For the moment. Can you be at a secure location this evening? Tell me where and when." Another brief pause. Then Hoyle gave her an address. Not an office. A private location. Neutral. Chosen the way careful people choose meeting places when the stakes make a wrong choice irreversible. 7 o'clock, Hoyle said. "Come alone. Don't tell anyone." "I understand." She hung up. She sat for a long moment with the phone in her hand, the legal pad in front of her, the drive in her bag, and the weight of the past 16 hours pressing down on the whole architecture of her life. She was 37 years old, and she had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and she knew it with the full clarity of someone who has made the kind of decision that reorganizes everything that comes after it into before and after. Before, the lamb, the wine pan, the ring, the ballroom, the drive in the rain, the velvet bench, the inventory. After, this. Downstairs, Adrian stopped pacing. In the silence that followed, Isabella heard his phone ring. She heard him answer it, and then she heard, not the words, just the register, the way his voice changed from the stripped, uncertain quality it had held upstairs to something harder and more closed, the professional register snapping back into place like a mask resettled after a wind. She heard him become once again the man the world knew. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She looked at the legal pad one final time, at the name underlined twice, at the date at the top of the page, at the word afraid with a line beneath it. She turned off the desk lamp and walked out of the dressing room. And this time, when she came to the top of the stairs, she did not pause, did not listen at the study door, did not allow herself the small mercy of hesitation. She went down the stairs. She walked through the front hall. She opened the front door and stepped outside into the afternoon, which was cold and gray and perfectly, uselessly beautiful. The light, the color of old pewter across the dead grass of the front lawn. She did not look back at the house. She got into her car and drove toward a meeting that would, by morning, make every step she'd taken since the ballroom irreversible, and carry the wreckage of 30 years of patient, careful, devastating betrayal to the one place Vincent Romano had never once considered she might take it. She had nothing left to protect, which meant she had nothing left to lose, which meant, for the first time since the night she'd walked into that ballroom, she was the most dangerous thing in the room. Any room. Margaret Hoyle was not what Isabella had expected. She'd constructed a mental image during the drive, the kind of federal prosecutor who appeared in news photographs outside courthouses, contained and press-ready, wearing the professional neutrality of someone who had learned that being visibly formidable was its own liability. She'd expected someone polished, someone who would take her information with practiced efficiency and make her feel, in some subtle institutional way, like a resource being processed. The woman who opened the door of the Ardmore safe house was 51 years old, wearing a cable-knit sweater with a coffee stain near the second button, her dark hair pulled back with the functional indifference of someone who had not thought about it since morning. She looked at Isabella the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, not unkindly, but with the focused attention of someone whose primary interest is the information rather than the container. "You're alone," she said. Not a question. "Yes." "Anyone follow you?" Isabella had taken 3 route changes, doubled back twice through a residential neighborhood, and sat for 6 minutes in a parking structure watching the ramp entrance before continuing. "No." Hoyle stepped back from the door. The interior of the safe house was functional and impersonal in the specific way of spaces that are used regularly but never lived in. A kitchen table with 4 chairs, a laptop, a recording device still in its case on the counter, a whiteboard along one wall covered in writing that had been partially erased and rewritten in layers, the ghost text of previous sessions visible beneath the current one. 2 other people were in the room, a man in his late 30s with the build and the watchful stillness of someone with a law enforcement background, and a younger woman with a laptop open who looked up briefly when Isabella entered and then looked back at the screen. Hoyle gestured at the table. "Sit down. Coffee?" "Please." She poured from a pot that had been sitting long enough to be past its best, set the cup down without ceremony, and sat across from Isabella. The man took a position near the wall. The younger woman continued typing. "Walk me through it," Hoyle said. "From the beginning. Don't edit." Isabella walked her through it. All of it, from the order in which she'd discovered things, not in the order that made narrative sense, but in the raw sequential truth of how the information had actually arrived. The lockbox, the phone link, the ballroom, Marcus, Ellis Carver, the documents, the drive, the conversation through the study door, Adrian's face when she'd asked about the ring, the specific quality of fear in his voice when he'd said don't do anything. Hoyle listened the way Marcus Webb listened, completely, without interrupting, without the small affirmative sounds that most people inserted to signal engagement. When Isabella finished, Hoyle was quiet for approximately 10 seconds, looking at the table surface. Then she looked up. The drive. As Isabella took it from her bag and set it on the table, Hoyle didn't pick it up immediately. She looked at it. Then she looked at Isabella. "You understand that once you give that to me, there's a process. It goes into evidence. It becomes part of a federal investigation. Your access to it, your ability to control what happens with the information on it, ends." "I understand. And you understand that your husband—" "I understand," Isabella said again, evenly. Hoyle held her gaze for a moment. Then she picked up the drive and handed it to the man near the wall without looking at him. He left the room. "Ellis Carver," Hoyle said. "Where is he now?" "Somewhere safe. Marcus Webb is handling his relocation." "Webb." Hoyle wrote the name on a notepad with a mechanical pencil. "He's Adrian Moretti's attorney." "He was Adrian's attorney. He's been holding documentation relating to Romano's financial infiltration of the Moretti organization for an undisclosed period. He's prepared to cooperate." "Why didn't he come forward before?" The question was direct and without judgment, which Isabella appreciated more than she'd expected to, because he believed in protecting the organization even when he had questions about its direction, and because coming forward with what he had without a credible inside source would have gotten him killed and accomplished nothing. She paused. He was waiting for the right person. Hoyle wrote something else. "And you're that person." "Apparently." Hoyle almost smiled. "Ms. Moretti, I've been trying to build a case against Vincent Romano for 2 years. The obstruction I've encountered at every level, not just inside the criminal network, but inside legitimate institutions, law firms, financial regulators, 1 or 2 places inside this building that I won't name, has been consistent enough to confirm that his reach is considerably broader than what we've been able to document. She set down the pencil. What you've given me tonight, if the documentation holds, it holds, Isabella said. If it holds, Hoyle continued, with the careful precision of someone who had been burned before by confidence, gives us the financial architecture, the shell company structure, the offshore transfers, the beneficial ownership chain. That's the foundation. She paused. What we still need is testimony. Someone who can place Romano in direct communication with Vivian Cross. Someone who can speak to the manipulation of Adrian Moretti's decision-making over a specific period. Documentary evidence of conspiracy is powerful, but in front of a jury, testimony is what makes it irreversible. Isabella turned her coffee cup in her hands. Ellis Carver can speak to the financial records. He built some of the original structures, under Dominic Moretti, legitimately, and can explain precisely where and how they were subverted. That's financial testimony. I need someone closer to the personal relationship between Romano and Cross. Hoyle looked at her steadily. Ideally, someone inside the Moretti organization who had direct contact with Vivian Cross and can speak to the pattern of influence over time. Isabella understood what she was being asked without being asked. You want Adrian. I want whoever can give me Romano directly. Adrian Moretti is the most logical candidate if he's been as thoroughly manipulated as your documentation suggests. Hoyle paused. But that conversation is yours to have. I won't approach him. Not yet. Not until you've had the opportunity to, she chose her word carefully, establish the ground. Isabella sat with that for a moment. Establish the ground. 12 hours ago, she'd been preparing lamb and opening wine and trying to find a way back into her own marriage. Now she was sitting in a federal safe house discussing whether she was willing to be the person who walked her husband toward a choice that would define the rest of his life. Give me a week, she said. You have 5 days, Hoyle said. After that, my timeline moves regardless. I have a grand jury window that closes, and I won't get another one for 6 months. 5 days. Isabella nodded. She drove home through streets that were empty in the particular way of a city that has gone interior for the night, the storefronts dark, the traffic lights cycling through their colors for nobody. She felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been operating on cognitive reserves for 20 hours. Not physical tiredness, but the deeper kind. The kind that settles into the decision-making centers and makes every subsequent choice feel slightly heavier than it should. She was 4 blocks from the estate when her phone rang. Unknown number, different from the one that had sent her the ballroom link the previous night, but the same category of unknown, deliberately scrubbed clean of identifying information. She answered it. Yes. A voice she didn't recognize. Male, older, with a slight regional lilt she couldn't immediately place. Somewhere mid-Atlantic, but coastal, the kind of accent that had been cultivated rather than inherited, precise in the way of a man who was accustomed to being listened to and had never developed the habit of repeating himself. Mrs. Moretti, he said, I think it's time we introduced ourselves properly. The cold moved up from her feet. You've had a productive day, the voice continued. The Ardmore meeting, Margaret Hoyle. You were in that house for 1 hour and 23 minutes. A pause. The coffee was terrible, I assume. It always is. She pulled the car over. Same side street as the night before, different block, the same universe of dim storefronts and wet pavement. She put it in park. She did not speak. I'm not calling to threaten you, the voice said. I want you to understand that immediately. If I wanted to threaten you, you would know it, and this would be a different kind of call. Another pause, and she could hear in the pause the particular patience of someone who had been in control of situations for so long that patience had become indistinguishable from confidence. I'm calling because you are a more impressive person than I gave you credit for, and I've made a career of not underestimating people twice. Vincent Romano, she said. A brief silence. Yes. She gripped the steering wheel with one hand and breathed. How? How do I have your number? How did I know about Ardmore? How long have I been watching? She heard the ghost of something in his voice. Not amusement, but its older, tireder cousin. All reasonable questions. I'll answer them in the order they matter. Your number has been accessible to me for approximately 4 years, since the secondary monitoring system was established in the Moretti household. Ardmore was known to me because I have known about Margaret Hoyle's safe house locations since she established them. And the answer to the third question is the one you actually want. She waited. 30 years, he said. Give or take. She thought about what Ellis had told her about her grandfather, about Frank Caruso in 1997 and a heart attack that Ellis had declined to directly contradict. My grandfather, she said. Frank Caruso was a stubborn man, Romano said, without heat, almost with a kind of retrospective respect that made her stomach turn precisely because it sounded genuine. He had a code I didn't agree with and couldn't negotiate around. I respected it even as I opposed it. I want you to know that. I don't care what you respected. No, I wouldn't expect you to. He paused. Here is what I'm calling to tell you. The documentation you gave Margaret Hoyle this evening is real, and it is substantial, and under normal circumstances, it would represent a serious problem for my operational continuity. You should understand that I know it's real, because I know exactly what Ellis Carver retained when he left the Moretti organization 3 years ago. I've always known. Another pause. I allowed him to keep it. She went very still. I'm sorry? She said. Ellis Carver retained documentation that implicates my financial network in the Moretti restructuring. He has had that documentation for 3 years. I am aware of it. I chose not to retrieve it or neutralize it. Romano's voice was entirely calm, patient, the voice of a man explaining a mechanism. Because the documentation, while real, is incomplete in a specific way that makes it useful to me as a controlled disclosure, and dangerous to you as an uncontrolled one. Her hand on the steering wheel had gone cold. What do you mean, incomplete? The shell company structure that Carver documented traces the financial transfers accurately. What it does not contain, what I was careful to ensure it would not contain 3 years ago when I allowed him to leave with what he had, is the documentation of who authorized the original structures. The beneficial ownership chain, as Carver understands it, terminates at a series of trusts. Those trusts, when Hoyle's forensic accountants examine them, will trace back to a single authorized signatory. A pause, precise and deliberate as a surgical incision. Your husband's name is on those documents, Mrs. Moretti, not mine. Adrian Moretti is, on paper, the architect of every financial structure you just handed to the federal government. The sound of the city around her was suddenly very far away, a bus passing on the main street a block over, the distant mechanical compression of a truck's brakes. That's not possible, she said. Her voice came out even. She had no idea how. He signed them. Over a period of 14 months, some he signed knowing they were restructuring documents and believing they were legitimate diversification, as Vivian explained them to him. Others he signed without reading them carefully, as busy men often sign documents their trusted advisors present. And some, Romano paused, he signed in ways that can be interpreted as knowing authorization of criminal financial structures. The distinction between those 3 categories is a matter of forensic accounting and prosecutorial interpretation, and I think you understand which interpretation Margaret Hoyle will be inclined to apply. Isabella's breathing had gone shallow. She was aware of it, aware of her chest moving in small, tight increments, and she could not seem to correct it. You built a trap, she said. I built a document trail that functions as one thing from the inside and another thing from the outside. Inside the organization, it looks like Romano's infiltration of Moretti's finances. From the outside, from the position of a federal investigation, it looks like Adrian Moretti constructing a money laundering architecture and using a shell of criminal conspiracy as cover. He let that sit for a moment. The documentation you gave Hoyle tonight will, within 72 hours of forensic review, result in the issuance of an arrest warrant for your husband. She pressed her eyes closed, opened them. And not for you. The structures don't touch me directly. They never did. That was the design. Ellis's documentation is real in every particular except the one that matters for criminal liability. Who built it and whose name is on the authorization. I'm afraid Mr. Carver was given access only to the documents I chose to have him see, the ones that told an incomplete story. Another pause. A story that is now in the hands of federal investigators. The cold had moved all the way through her now. Not the adrenaline cold of earlier in the evening, but something deeper and more structural. The cold of a person who has just understood the shape of the mistake they've made and cannot see immediately how to unmake it. She had walked into this. She had carried the documentation herself, carried it in her bag to the woman who would use it to destroy her husband, and she had done it with the conviction of someone operating with complete information, and the information had been curated by the man now speaking to her in a calm voice from an unknown location. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "Because you have approximately 60 hours before Hoyle's forensic team completes a preliminary review and begins drafting the warrant. And because what you do in those 60 hours interests me considerably." He paused. "You are, as I said, more impressive than I expected. Your grandfather would have been proud. And I say that without any expectation that it comforts you." "If you mention my grandfather again," she said, and her voice was very quiet, "I will find you personally, and it will not go well for either of us." A silence, longer than the previous ones. "Understood," he said. "What do you want?" "Presently? Nothing. I wanted you to have accurate information." A pause. "What happens next is entirely your decision. You can do nothing. The warrant issues, Adrian is arrested, the Moretti organization collapses under federal asset seizure, and I absorb the remaining operational territory within 18 months, which is what I've been positioning for. You can attempt to retract the documentation from Hoyle, which she will not allow, and which will expose you to obstruction liability. Or," he stopped. "Or," she said, "or you find the one piece of documentation that I was not able to sanitize. The one thing that places me in direct connection to the structure in a way that can't be explained away." He paused. "I believe you know where it is, even if you don't know you know. Why would you tell me that? Because finding it is almost certainly impossible in 60 hours, and because watching you try will be—" He chose his word with the deliberate precision she was coming to recognize. "Instructive." The line went dead. She sat in the parked car for a long time. The bus stop across the street cycled through 2 buses, both nearly empty, their interiors lit against the dark. She watched them without seeing them, running through everything she knew in the specific high-velocity way the mind operates when it is genuinely frightened and has no choice but to function anyway. Adrian's name on the documents, 60 hours. Hoyle's forensic team, the one piece Romano couldn't sanitize. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the first ring. "I need you to stop," she said. "Stop what?" "Everything. Whatever access you've given Hoyle's team to the documentation chain, whatever additional materials you are preparing to share, stop." She pressed her fingers against her forehead. "The financial records are compromised, specifically compromised. I'll explain when I see you, but I need you to stop cooperating with the federal investigation immediately." A silence on Marcus's end that contained a great deal. "Isabella, I've already—" He stopped. "I received a call from Hoyle's office 2 hours ago requesting a preliminary document inventory. I provided it." Her stomach dropped. "What did you give them?" "A summary of categories. Not the documents themselves. They're requesting a formal handover tomorrow at 9 a.m. Tomorrow at 9? She had until then to what? She pressed her eyes shut, ran the calculation. If she called Hoyle and told her to stop the review, Hoyle would want to know why. And any answer Isabella gave that contained Romano's name would alert Hoyle that the source had made contact, which was itself information that could be used in ways Isabella couldn't control. If she said nothing and let the review proceed, Adrian was arrested within 72 hours on documentation that had been built to destroy him. And if she tried to reach Adrian directly, she thought about his face when he'd said, "Don't do anything." The fear. The specific fear of a man who suspected something he couldn't name. What if he already knew? What if he'd known something was wrong with the documents, and that was why he'd been afraid? What if, "Don't do anything" wasn't a plea from guilt, but a warning. "Marcus," she said, "cancel the 9 o'clock." "On what grounds?" "Tell them the documentation requires additional authentication review. Tell them we discovered an irregularity. Give them anything that buys me 24 hours. "Isabella." His voice had shifted into the register she recognized as his real voice. Not the attorney, not the operator, but the old man who had known her grandfather. "What happened?" "Romano called me." The silence on his end was absolute. "He's been watching this entire time," she said. "The documentation Ellis retained, it's real, but it's incomplete in a specific direction. The financial structures trace back to Adrian's signature, not Romano's. It was designed that way from the beginning." She paused. "I gave Hoyle a case against my husband." She heard Marcus exhale. Slowly, completely, the sound of someone releasing something they'd been holding. "There is something else," she said. "He told me there's one piece of documentation he couldn't sanitize, one thing that places him directly in connection to the structure." "Did he say what it was?" "He said I know where it is without knowing I know." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "He told you that?" "Yes." "Why would he tell you that?" "He said finding it in 60 hours is almost impossible." She looked through the windshield at the empty street. "He's giving me a problem he's certain I can't solve, because he wants to watch what I do when I try." "Or," Marcus said slowly, "he wants you focused on finding it so that you're not focused on something else." She straightened. Marcus continued, his voice careful, feeling its way toward something. "Romano has spent 30 years being careful about what he touches directly. If there is documentation that places him in direct connection, documentation he couldn't sanitize, the reason he couldn't sanitize it is because he didn't know it existed." A pause. "Which means someone inside his own operation created it without his knowledge." She thought about the photograph in Ellis's folder, Vivian and the elderly man at the restaurant, leaning toward each other. The timestamp. 16 months ago. Vivian. Vivian Cross, who had been placed inside the Moretti organization at Romano's direction, who had been in Romano's employment for 8 years, who had, as of last night, accepted a public proposal and a ring that wasn't hers, in front of 500 witnesses. At an event that had been designed, Isabella understood now, with cold clarity, not to celebrate a relationship, but to cement a public narrative. Vivian, publicly engaged to the head of the Moretti organization. Vivian, positioned as the next Mrs. Moretti. Why would Romano want that? He was dismantling the Moretti organization. He didn't need Vivian inside it as a spouse. He needed her as an operative. Unless Vivian had stopped being purely Romano's operative somewhere along the way. Unless 8 years in close proximity to Adrian Moretti had produced something Romano hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully control. Unless Vivian Cross had her own agenda. Isabella's mind moved very fast and very cold through the next sequence of implications. If Vivian had created documentation that Romano couldn't sanitize, documentation of Romano's direct involvement, she'd done it as insurance. You didn't build insurance unless you were afraid of the person you were insured against. And you didn't build it publicly, you built it somewhere safe, somewhere that couldn't be retrieved without your cooperation. "Marcus," she said, "when Vivian was referred into the organization 6 years ago, who vouched for her?" He thought for a moment. "Thomas Greer. He was a senior captain then, liaison to the Bianchi family." "Where's Greer now?" "Federal prison. Convicted on separate charges 18 months ago." A pause. "He's been cooperative with the government on unrelated matters in exchange for sentence reduction." "Thomas Greer, federal prison. Cooperative." She thought about Hoyle's words. "I need someone who can place Romano in direct communication with Vivian Cross." What if that person wasn't Adrian? What if that person was already in federal custody and had been for 18 months, holding information that connected Romano to Cross, waiting for someone to ask the right question? "Marcus." Her voice was different now. Not the controlled evenness of the past hour, but something harder and more directed. The voice of a person who has just found the edge of a shape they've been trying to identify in the dark. I need you to reach out to Thomas Greer's attorney tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. It's nearly midnight. I know what time it is. A pause. What do I tell them? Tell them we have information about the person who originally recommended Vivian Cross to the Moretti organization, and we believe Mr. Greer may have been kept unaware of her actual affiliations at the time. Tell them we're prepared to provide documentation that could support a motion for sentence reduction based on prosecutorial misconduct, specifically that Greer was induced to vouch for a Romano operative without being informed of her background. She paused. Tell them we need 20 minutes with him before 9 a.m. Another silence from Marcus. She could hear him absorbing the architecture of it, not just the immediate move, but the several moves behind it, the chain of consequence. You're going to use Greer to connect Romano to Cross, he said. Romano said I have 60 hours. I have less than that now. She started the car. If Greer can give us direct testimony placing Romano as the source of Cross's referral, testimony that can be verified against whatever documentation Cross built for her own insurance, then what I gave Hoyle tonight doesn't destroy Adrian. It becomes the foundation of a legitimate case against Romano, with Adrian's signed documents recontextualized as the product of deliberate manipulation. It's a very narrow thread, Marcus said. It's the only thread. She pulled out of the parking space and back onto the street, driving now without doubling back, without watching the ramp. Because Romano already knew where she was and where she was going, and it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was speed and precision and the willingness to stop being careful in the ways she'd been careful until now. She drove toward the estate. She needed 3 things: 6 hours of actual sleep, Adrian's private files from the study, specifically the referral documentation from 6 years ago when Vivian had joined the organization, and the photograph from Ellis's folder of Vivian and Romano at the restaurant. She needed the photograph because there was something about it she'd registered and not processed in the moment. Something about the awning of the restaurant, the specific typeface of the name on the awning, that was nagging at the edge of her memory with the persistence of a detail that knew it mattered. She pulled into the estate drive and sat for a moment with the engine idling, looking at the lit windows of the house. 2 windows in the study, 1 in the kitchen, the master bedroom dark. She went inside. She went directly to the study. The door was open, the desk lamp still on, the desk itself clear in the way it always was except for one thing, a single piece of paper, face down, placed precisely in the center of the desk. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. She crossed the room, turned it over. It was a photograph. Printed on regular copy paper, clearly from a digital source, the resolution slightly degraded. It showed a restaurant, outdoor seating, an awning, the same restaurant from Ellis's surveillance photograph, the same awning she'd been trying to place. But this photograph was different. This one showed not Vivian and Romano, but Adrian. Younger, she estimated 5, 6 years ago, before the lines had settled around his eyes. Seated across from a man she now recognized, even in a slightly degraded print, as a younger Vincent Romano. They were leaning toward each other over the table with the body language of 2 people having a conversation they both understood to be consequential. Beneath the photograph, in handwriting she didn't recognize, 4 words. He was there first. She stood very still in the quiet study, holding the piece of paper, and the ground beneath everything she thought she'd understood shifted in a way that had no recovery built into it. He was there first. Not he was manipulated into it. Not he was led there without knowing. Not the story she'd been building since midnight. The story of a husband who had been Romano's greatest victim, deceived and used and finally broken by a 30-year plan he'd never seen coming. He was there first. Which meant the meeting between Adrian and Romano had not been arranged by Vivian, had not been the product of 14 months of careful infiltration, had predated Vivian's arrival in the organization by, she did the math with hands that had gone completely numb, by at least a year, possibly more, which meant everything she thought she knew about who had been manipulated and who had been complicit had just rearranged itself into a shape she didn't recognize and could not immediately read. She set the photograph down on the desk. She stood in the silent study of her husband's house, surrounded by his things, and understood that the ground she'd thought she was standing on had been built on someone else's blueprint, and that the only question left was whether the person who'd placed this photograph on this desk tonight had done it to destroy her or to save her, and that she had no idea. Not yet. Which of those things was true? She stood in the study for 4 minutes. She knew it was 4 minutes because she counted them. Not deliberately, but the way the mind counts things when it needs something mechanical to hold on to, while the rest of it processes an impact that is too large to absorb all at once. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, the silent arithmetic of a person standing very still in the wreckage of a narrative they'd built over the past 24 hours, and watching the pieces settle into a completely different shape. He was there first. 4 words on a piece of copy paper, and everything she thought she understood about what she was doing and why she was doing it had cracked down the center like a frozen lake in early spring. Not broken through yet, but changed, the integrity of the surface suddenly in question with every step. She picked up the photograph again, looked at it carefully, the way she should have looked at everything carefully from the beginning, with the specific attention of someone who understands that the framing of information is itself a form of information. Who had printed this? Who had placed it here? The study had been locked when she'd gone upstairs 3 hours ago. She'd heard Adrian turn the key, the particular double click of the deadbolt he used when he was done for the night, which meant someone with a key had been in this room between then and now, or Adrian had placed it himself. She turned that over. Adrian placing a photograph on his own desk, face down, in the center, placing it like a confession left out, like something he needed her to find but couldn't bring himself to hand her directly. She thought about his voice on the stairs. Don't do anything, please. The please specifically, which was a word she had heard Adrian Moretti use exactly twice in 11 years of marriage, and both times under circumstances of genuine extremity. She took the photograph to the kitchen, under better light, and looked at it again. The restaurant awning. She'd been trying to place the typeface, and now, under the kitchen fluorescence, she had it. Castellan's, on the waterfront, which had been a neutral meeting ground for the city's business community since the early 90s. The kind of place where deals were made in plain sight because the lighting was good and the tables were far enough apart, and nobody who ate there was important enough to be recognizable to the general public, but important enough that being seen there meant nothing, because everyone there was seen there. She'd been to Castellan's once. For lunch, 7 years ago, with a woman she'd met through a charity board. She tried to remember whether Adrian had been there, whether he'd had any particular reaction to the name of the restaurant, and she couldn't pull it up, which told her nothing except that 7 years ago she hadn't yet developed the habit of filing Adrian's reactions to specific locations. She set the photograph on the kitchen counter. She needed to think, and she needed to eat something, which she hadn't done since a cup of terrible coffee in Ardmore, and the combination of exhaustion and hunger was beginning to produce the specific cognitive degradation that manifested as an inability to prioritize. She found bread, found butter, stood at the counter, and ate 2 slices of toast without tasting them, staring at the photograph. Adrian had met Romano before Vivian arrived. That was the fact. The photograph existed, the timestamp was implicit in Adrian's apparent age, and the inference was, what exactly? That the meeting was voluntary? That Adrian had sought Romano out, or that Romano had sought Adrian and Adrian had agreed to meet? A meeting at a public restaurant was not the same as a conspiracy. People in Adrian's position met with other power figures constantly. It was the operational requirement of maintaining the kind of relationships that kept organizations stable. But they didn't meet with Vincent Romano casually. Romano was known, not as widely as he should have been, but to the people who needed to know, as a specific kind of threat to the Moretti family. The animosity went back 30 years, to Frank Caruso, to Isabella's grandfather, which meant if Adrian had sat across the table from Vincent Romano and had a conversation serious enough that someone thought it worth photographing, it was not a casual meeting. It was a decision. She pressed both hands flat on the counter and looked at the ceiling. The question was not whether to confront Adrian. The question was when and how much to reveal, and what she needed from him before the clock ran out. Hoyle's forensic team would begin its preliminary review of the documents at 9 a.m. Marcus had the capacity to delay by 24 hours, maybe 36, if his stated rationale was plausible enough. That gave her until sometime tomorrow night at the outside edge. She needed 3 things in that window. She needed to know what Adrian's meeting with Romano had actually been about. She needed to reach Thomas Greer before Hoyle's people did. And she needed to find whatever insurance Vivian had built, the documentation Romano couldn't sanitize, before Vivian had any reason to move it or destroy it. She was assembling the sequence of that in her head when she heard the study door open. She heard Adrian's footsteps in the hall. They stopped outside the kitchen. She didn't move. She stayed where she was, hands on the counter, the photograph in front of her, the toast half eaten. He came into the kitchen. He was dressed, not in yesterday's clothes. He'd changed, which meant he'd been awake and deliberate about it, in dark trousers and a dark shirt, no jacket. He looked at her across the kitchen. He looked at the photograph on the counter. Something in his face went very still. "You found it," he said. "I found it." She watched him. "Did you put it there?" He crossed to the kitchen island slowly and stood on the other side of it. The island between them was approximately 4 feet of granite, which was not a great distance, but the way he stopped at it made it feel like something more significant than a kitchen feature. "Yes." "Why?" He pressed his jaw, looked at the photograph. "Because I couldn't say it." "What couldn't you say?" He looked up. His eyes were, she noted with the detached precision of exhaustion, red at the edges. Not from crying, Adrian did not cry. She had never once seen it. But from the sustained effort of not sleeping and not saying what needed to be said. "I met with Romano 5 years ago," he said. "Once. He reached out through an intermediary and said he wanted a conversation, not a negotiation, not a proposal, a conversation." He paused. "I was stupid enough to think I could meet with him and walk away without it meaning anything." "What did he want?" "He wanted to tell me about my father." Adrian's voice was flat and deliberate, the way voices get when the speaker has rehearsed the words and the rehearsal has stripped them of whatever charge they originally carried. Specifically, about things my father did in the early years of the organization that weren't in any record I had access to. Financial arrangements, agreements with people I'd never heard of. He paused. He said my father had been planning to join Romano's network the year before he died. That the alliance your grandfather refused was the same one my father had secretly agreed to. That I'd inherited an organization built on a foundation I didn't fully understand. She breathed. "Was it true?" "I don't know." He looked at her directly. "I never found out. Because 3 weeks after that meeting, Romano stopped making contact. The intermediary disappeared. And 6 months later, Vivian arrived with a referral from Thomas Greer, and she was good at her job, and I was..." He stopped, started again. "I was dealing with questions about my father I didn't know how to answer, and she was very good at providing clarity, at making complicated things seem manageable." His voice didn't change on the last sentence, didn't soften or harden. He delivered it like a man reading a deposition. "She was placed there," Isabella said. "I know that now." "Did you suspect it?" He held her gaze. "Not until 8 months ago." 8 months ago. She filed that, the same interval she'd marked for herself when she'd begun to suspect Vivian specifically, the past salt at the October dinner. "What happened 8 months ago?" she said. "I found a discrepancy in a financial report. Small. The kind of thing that could have been a rounding error. I had it examined quietly by someone outside the normal accounting chain." He paused. "The trail led to accounts I didn't recognize, structures I hadn't authorized, and when I started pulling the thread..." He stopped, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was not managed, a flash of something raw and not fully controlled. "When I started pulling the thread, I found my own signature on documents I had no memory of signing." The room was very quiet. "You were being set up," she said. "I was being set up." He said it without inflection, without the defensive urgency of someone trying to establish their innocence, just the flat acknowledgement of a fact. "And I didn't know who was doing it, or how far it went, or who inside the organization I could trust. So I..." He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose, a gesture she recognized as the Adrian Moretti equivalent of visible distress. "I made the worst decision I've ever made." She waited. "I went to Vivian," he said. "I confronted her with what I'd found, and she..." He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "She told me she knew who was behind it. She said she could prove it, but the proof required establishing her publicly inside the organization in a way that was unambiguous. She said Romano," she named Romano specifically, said she'd been aware of his involvement for months and had been building her own documentation. She said the only way to protect the organization and expose him was if she appeared to be fully trusted, publicly, irrevocably trusted. Isabella understood before he finished the sentence. The nausea of it moved through her like something physical. The proposal. He couldn't look at her. It was the only moment in the conversation, she noted, where he could not look at her. She said it needed to be public enough that Romano's informants inside the organization would report it back. She said it would force Romano to make a move ahead of his own timeline. She said, his voice dropped. She said you would understand, once it was explained, that you were smart enough to understand that it was operational. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the silence of something that cannot be unsaid or unheard, settling into the permanent record of the room. She said I would understand, Isabella repeated. Yes. She used my grandmother's ring. He flinched, the whole body. Not just the face, the actual physical flinch of someone absorbing an impact. I didn't know it was yours. I told her to get something that looked right for the setting. I wasn't thinking about where it came from. I was thinking about the operation. He paused. That's not an excuse. No, she said. It's not. She picked up the photograph from the counter and held it out to him. He took it, looked at it for a moment, then set it down. Where did this come from? She said. It was in my files. I kept it. I don't know why I kept it. Evidence, maybe, in case I needed to prove I'd been approached. He paused. When you left tonight, when I saw your car leave and I knew where you were going, or I guessed, you knew where I was going. I guessed. His eyes met hers. I put it on the desk because I needed you to know before whatever happened at that meeting happened. I needed you to have the full picture. A pause. Even if the full picture is worse. She studied him. 11 years of studying him. His specific tells, his registers, the difference between his operational voice and his real one, the precise ways in which he managed information even with her, even in private. 11 years of that, and she still couldn't be completely certain, but certain enough. She was certain enough. Vivian is not protecting you, she said. I know. She was Romano's operative before she was yours. Everything she told you 8 months ago, the plan, the operation, the proposal, Romano gave her that script. She performed it for you and you walked directly into it. She watched his face. The public engagement was never about forcing Romano's hand. It was Romano's final move. It put his operative in position as the next head of the Moretti family, while simultaneously giving him the documentation he needed to bring down the organization through federal prosecution. Your name on those documents, Adrian, your signature. He'd gone very still. She played you, Isabella said, and I walked the evidence straight to the federal prosecutor, who will use it to arrest you within 48 hours unless we find what she kept for herself. He looked at her for a long, long moment. What she kept for herself. Vivian built insurance against Romano. She's been inside his operation for 8 years. She knows enough to destroy him the same way he's destroying you. She kept documentation somewhere he can't access, something that places Romano in direct connection to the structure. She paused. I need to know where it is before Hoyle's team finishes its review. He was already moving. Her apartment. She keeps files. I've seen her reference physical files when she thought I wasn't watching. Hard copies, not digital. She doesn't trust digital for anything she considers irreplaceable, Isabella finished. They looked at each other across the kitchen island with the particular attention of two people who have just recategorized their relationship to each other in real time and are not entirely sure what the new category is. I need to come with you, he said. No. She picked up her bag. You need to call Danny Rowe and tell him you want eyes on Vivian's building. Not inside, outside. You need her watched, but not alarmed. If she moves, you call me. She paused. Can you do that without telling him why? He gave her a look that managed, even in the wreckage of the night, to convey the minor offense of being asked whether he could manage a basic operational instruction. Yes. Then do it. She was at the kitchen door when he said her name. Just her name again. The same stripped quality as on the stairs, the same absence of the usual authority. She stopped, didn't turn. I know, he said, that I don't have the right to ask you to trust me. I know that. But I need you to know that the ring... He stopped, started again. I would never have... Adrian, she said it quietly. Stop. He stopped. There'll be time for that later, she said. Or there won't be. She left the kitchen. She was in her car and 2 streets from the estate when her phone rang. Marcus. Greer's attorney called back, he said, and the quality of his voice told her immediately that whatever he was about to say had changed the shape of things again. And? Greer wants to talk. Tonight. A pause. Isabella, he's been waiting for someone to ask him about Vivian Cross for 18 months. He says he has a recording. Her hands tightened on the wheel. What kind of recording? A conversation between Romano and Cross, approximately 8 years ago, when she was first being positioned. Greer was present. He didn't know who Romano was at the time, only that Cross was being referred through a channel Greer understood as legitimate. He recorded it as a standard precaution. Marcus paused. He's held it for 18 months because no one with the right jurisdiction asked him the right question. Where is he? Haverford Federal Correctional. I've already cleared a late visitor access through his attorney. It's irregular, but the attorney has standing. A pause. It's 40 minutes from you? I'm already driving, she said. She drove hard, the city thinning out into the suburban dark of the highway, the speedometer sitting at 15 above the limit, and her eyes moving between the road and the mirror with the automatic vigilance of someone who had been operating in a state of sustained emergency for so long that hyper-alertness had started to feel like a resting state. She thought about what she had. Greer's recording, if it was what Marcus described, placed Romano as the architect of Vivian's placement. Combined with Ellis's financial documentation and the specific recontextualization of Adrian's signatures as the product of deliberate manipulation, it gave Hoyle not a case against Adrian Moretti, but a case against Vincent Romano, with Adrian as the corroborating witness rather than the primary defendant. If the recording was clean, if Greer would testify, if Marcus could hold Hoyle's forensic review until the pieces were in place, if Vivian's physical files were where Adrian thought they were and contained what Isabella needed. 4 ifs, and she had 40 hours. Haverford Federal Correctional was a low-slung building behind 2 fences on a flat stretch of road that looked, in the dark, like a distribution warehouse that had developed a security complex. She was met at the outer gate by a correctional officer who processed her with the brisk efficiency of someone doing a favor for a superior and wanting it noted, then led her through 2 sets of doors into a meeting room that smelled of institutional cleaning product and the specific airlessness of spaces that were never fully opened. Thomas Greer was 63 years old and had the dimensions and the demeanor of a man who had once been physically imposing and had spent 18 months recalibrating his self-image to something less. He sat across the table from her with his attorney, young, sharp-eyed, a woman who'd clearly been woken from sleep and had arrived anyway because the situation warranted it. He looked at Isabella for a moment. You're Frank Caruso's granddaughter. Yes. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something. Vivian Cross was brought to me through a contact I trusted. I was told she was the daughter of someone connected to a legitimate investment network in the Mid-Atlantic corridor. I vouched for her to Adrian based on that, he paused. I didn't know who she actually was. I didn't know about Romano until... He stopped, pressed his lips together. Until I heard his voice on my own recording and a prosecutor 2 years ago showed me his photograph and everything clicked into a shape I wished I'd seen earlier. Tell me about the recording, Isabella said. He looked at his attorney. She nodded. He reached into the folder in front of him and removed a single sheet. A transcript, Isabella realized, clean and formatted, with timestamps. I carried a recorder in those days, standard practice. Half the people in that world did, even if they never said so. It was March, 8 years ago. Cross came to my office to discuss the referral, and a man I knew only as Vincent, she introduced him as a business associate, was with her. He did most of the talking. Isabella looked at the transcript. Her eyes moved fast down the page, catching phrases. The Moretti family's long-term structural weakness. The wife is irrelevant. She's decorative. Once Adrian is adequately isolated from legitimate counsel. Romano's network absorbs the Eastern Territory within 2 years of the family's collapse. And then, near the bottom of the page, a sentence that she read twice. The grandmother's ring was a detail. Small things like that break people more reliably than large ones. When the time comes, use something she can't replace. She looked up from the page. Greer was watching her. He planned it, he said. The ring, 8 years ago. He planned it. The specific coldness that moved through her at that moment was different from every other variety of coldness she'd experienced in the past 40 hours. This one had an almost physical weight to it. The cold of a woman understanding that the most intimate cruelty of the past 2 days had not been improvised or incidental, but designed, blueprinted, scheduled into the architecture of her destruction by a man who had decided 8 years ago that the way to break Isabella Hart Moretti most efficiently was to take the one thing she could not replace. She set the transcript down. She breathed through her nose. She looked at Greer. "Will you testify?" she said. He looked at his attorney again. The attorney opened her mouth. "Yes," Greer said before she could speak. "I'll testify." She was back in her car at 1:40 a.m., the transcript photographed on her phone, Marcus already on a call with Hoyle's office, leaving a message that the handover of documentation was being delayed pending authentication review. She had the recording's existence confirmed. She had Greer's testimony. She had Adrian's willingness to cooperate. Fragile, unverified, but present. What she did not have was Vivian's insurance file. She called Adrian. He answered before the first ring finished. "Danny's got 2 men on her building. She hasn't moved." "The files." "Where exactly?" "Her study." "Second bedroom she uses as a workspace. She has a fireproof cabinet. Black, bolted to the wall behind the desk. She's referenced it twice in conversations I've had with her in that apartment. Once when she said something about keeping things that mattered in the right place, and once when—" He stopped. "When?" "When she told me that she always had a way out. Those words specifically, I always have a way out. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. The fireproof cabinet, insurance against Romano. Vivian's documentation, built quietly over 8 years, of every connection between Romano and the Moretti infiltration. Connection that Romano had scrubbed from everything else but couldn't scrub from Vivian's own private record because he didn't know it existed. "I need to get into that apartment," Isabella said. Silence on Adrian's end. Then, "Isabella, if Vivian finds out, she won't." "You don't know that." "Adrian," her voice was absolutely level. "I need to get into that apartment. Do you have a way in or not?" Another silence, longer. She could hear him breathing on the other end. That specific rhythm of a man weighing something and finding that all the weights on both sides of the scale are heavier than he'd prefer. "There's a building manager," he said finally. "His name is Pelham. He's been on the organization's secondary payroll for 6 years in exchange for access and silence. He has a master key." He paused. "He will not let you in without authorization from me." "Then call him." "If I call him, there's a record. Danny's operation log, the communication itself." "Adrian," she started the car. "Call him." She heard him exhale. A long, complete exhale. The sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding since the moment he'd placed a photograph face down on his desk. "I'll call him now. He'll meet you at the service entrance. Ground level, north side." She put the car in drive. "Tell him 15 minutes. She drove. The city was almost empty now, the kind of empty it got in the specific small hours between the last bars closing and the first delivery trucks starting their routes. And she moved through it at speed with both hands on the wheel and her mind running ahead of the car, already in Vivian's apartment, already at the cabinet, already holding whatever was inside. She thought about the transcript. Small things like that break people more reliably than large ones. She ran her thumb along the inside of her left ring finger where her wedding band sat. She'd been wearing it continuously for 11 years and had not once in the past 48 hours thought about taking it off. She thought about that for a moment and then stopped thinking about it because she didn't have the bandwidth and it wasn't relevant yet. Vivian's building was a converted Victorian on Aldermore Street, 6 stories, the kind of building that had been expensive 40 years ago and was very expensive now. She pulled into the alley behind it and cut the headlights, sat for a moment in the dark, assessing. One of Danny's men was visible near the front entrance, a shape in a car with the engine off. Good. She went to the north side service entrance and found a man in his 50s, heavy-set, with the expression of someone who had been woken up and was being paid enough that they'd decided not to be upset about it. He looked at her. Mrs. Moretti. Mr. Pelham. He had the master key in his hand. He looked at it for a moment, the way people look at things when they're deciding whether to make a point of what they're doing, and then without saying anything further, he led her inside and up a service stairwell to the 4th floor and unlocked the apartment door and stepped back. She went in. The apartment was dark and still and immaculately ordered. Vivian's things arranged with the precise intentionality of someone who had grown up without order and had compensated by constructing an adult life in which everything had an exact place. Isabella moved through the living room, found the second bedroom, found the desk, found the cabinet, black, fireproof, bolted to the wall, with a combination lock that she had no combination for. She stood in front of it for a moment, breathing, looking at it in the thin light coming through the window. She thought about Adrian's words. I always have a way out. She thought about what kind of person Vivian Cross actually was beneath the constructed precision. Someone who had spent 8 years performing a role so completely that the performance had to have produced, at some point, something real. You couldn't exist inside a life for 8 years, even a fabricated one, without the fabrication acquiring genuine weight. She thought about what the combination would be for a woman who had planned everything and trusted nothing and kept her insurance in a fireproof box because she understood that paper survived fire if you treated it correctly. She thought about the timestamp on the photograph of Vivian and Romano. 16 months ago. She thought about what Greer had said. March, 8 years ago. March. She reached for the lock. She turned the dial. 8 right, 3 left. March, the 3rd month. And the year, the original year. She tried the obvious combination, and the lock didn't open. She tried the reverse. She tried the date of the restaurant photograph from Ellis's folder, which she'd memorized along with everything else. The 3rd attempt opened the lock with a clean, heavy click. She pulled the cabinet door open. Inside, 3 manila folders and a sealed evidence envelope of the kind used by law enforcement, with a chain of custody form attached. Not official, not government-issued, but a deliberate imitation, the kind a person created when they wanted their private documentation to carry the weight of official procedure even in the absence of institutional backing. She opened the first folder. The top document was a signed letter on Romano's personal letterhead. The actual letterhead, she was certain, because the paper quality was specific in a way that couldn't be replicated cheaply, authorizing the placement of Vivian Cross within the Moretti organization and outlining the terms of her compensation and her operational objectives. Signed, dated, Romano's actual signature, which she recognized from the corporate registration documents Ellis had shown her. Her hands were not shaking. She was surprised by that. She opened the evidence envelope. Inside was a single USB drive, labeled in Vivian's handwriting, VR Communications, recorded. 14 months. 14 months. The same interval. The parallel tracking operation. Vivian recording Romano the same way Romano had been tracking everyone else. She held the drive in her palm, in the dark apartment, in the silence of the small hours, and understood that she was holding enough to give Margaret Hoyle the case she'd been building for 2 years and not been able to complete. She was putting the folders back in order, preparing to close the cabinet, when she heard the apartment's front door open. She froze. Footsteps. Deliberate, unhurried. Not the stumbling entry of someone who'd forgotten something, but the measured walk of a person who had come here with a purpose and was not surprised to be here in the middle of the night. One set of footsteps, and then, behind them, the sound of the door being locked from the inside. She stood in the dark study, one hand on the cabinet door, the USB drive in her palm, and listened to the footsteps come through the living room and stop outside the study door. The door opened. Vivian Cross stood in the doorway with the study lamp she'd just switched on making a halo of the light behind her. She was dressed in a coat she hadn't removed, her hair exactly as it had been in the ballroom 12 hours ago, her face carrying the precise neutral expression that Isabella had spent 6 years trying to read and never fully succeeded. Her left hand, Isabella noted, was bare. No ring. She looked at Isabella with the cabinet open behind her, the folders on the desk, the drive in her palm. She took in all of it in approximately 2 seconds, the way a person takes in a scene when they've already run the probability of this moment and have a response ready. "Put the drive down," Vivian said. Isabella did not put the drive down. "Isabella!" Vivian's voice was even, low, with the specific quality of someone who was managing a situation they'd planned for but had not wanted to arrive. "I came here to get that myself, to give it to you." She paused. "I left the ring in the car. I was going to—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "Romano called me 40 minutes ago. He told me he'd spoken to you." Isabella's grip on the drive tightened. "He's moving his timeline," Vivian said. "The summit he's been organizing, the gathering of the family heads, it's not next month. It's tomorrow night." She looked at Isabella directly, with an expression that was the first unmanaged thing Isabella had ever seen on her face. Not guilt, not fear, but something that looked painfully like exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been performing for a very long time. "If we don't get everything to Hoyle before tomorrow evening, he controls the room and the documentation, and there is no case, against anyone." The silence between them was the loudest thing in the apartment. "Why should I believe you?" Isabella said. Vivian looked at her. The first look, really looked, that had ever passed between them without the mediation of whatever role each was playing in the other's orbit. "Because I have been in Romano's organization for 8 years, she said, "and I'm tired. And because the ring—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "He told me to use something irreplaceable. I didn't know what it was until I had it in my hand. And by then—" She stopped again. "By then, the plan was already in motion," Isabella said. "Yes." "And you went ahead anyway?" Vivian held her gaze. "Yes." Isabella looked at her for a long moment, at the bare left hand, at the coat she hadn't removed, at the exhaustion that had finally made it to the surface of the face that had been so carefully maintained. "The summit," she said. "Where?" "Hadley House, Romano's estate in the county. He owns it through a trust. It's not on any record connected to his name." Vivian paused. "He's invited the 7 senior family representatives and 14 of their captains. He's going to present the dissolution of the Moretti organization as an accomplished fact and propose a reorganization under his direct control. He has the financial documentation, your husband's signatures, ready to distribute as evidence of the Moretti family's criminal exposure, which will be used to justify the transfer of operational territory." Isabella thought about Hoyle, about the 40 hours that had just compressed while she'd been standing in this study into something significantly smaller. How many people at that summit are Romanos? 5 of the 7 family heads. The remaining 2 are genuine independents who don't yet know what tonight's meeting is actually about. Vivian paused. If those 2 leave that summit with Romano's version of events, the consolidation happens regardless of what the federal case eventually finds. Isabella's mind moved through it. The sequence, the timing, the pieces she had, the recording from Greer, the letter on Romano's letterhead, the 14 months of communications on the drive in her palm, Adrian willing to testify, Marcus holding Hoyle's timeline by a thread. She needed Hoyle at that summit, not afterward, not with a warrant issued on the documentation she'd already provided. At the summit, while Romano was in the room, while he was presenting his 30-year plan as an accomplished fact, while he was confident, the way careful men become careless when they are certain of their victory. Hidden cameras, a room full of confessions. She looked at Vivian. "Can you get me into Hadley House?" she said. Vivian's expression shifted. Not surprise, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone who has run multiple scenarios and has just watched the other person select the most difficult one. You'd be walking into a room with Romano and 20 people who are either his operatives or his targets. "Can you get me in?" Isabella said again. Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "But once you're inside, I can't guarantee—" "I'm not asking for guarantees." Isabella pocketed the drive, picked up the folders, and looked at Vivian across the dark study. I'm asking for access. What I do with it is my problem. Vivian looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across her face that might, in different lighting, in a different life, have looked like respect. Romano told me once, she said quietly, that the only variable he couldn't account for was a person with nothing left to lose. He should have thought about that before he took the ring, Isabella said. She walked past Vivian, through the apartment, out the service entrance, and into the cold dark of the alley where her car was waiting, and called Adrian before she'd covered the first 10 feet. He answered on half a ring. Well? I have the documentation. She got in the car, and I need you to make the hardest phone call of your life. To who? To Margaret Hoyle, she said. Right now, tonight. She started the engine. And Adrian, I need you to tell her everything, not the version, everything. A silence on his end, 5 seconds. She counted them. All right, he said. Not I'll try. Not let me think about it. Just all right, with the specific finality of a man who has run out of alternative options and discovered, at the bottom of the stack, something that felt almost like relief. She pulled out of the alley. Tomorrow night, at Hadley House, Vincent Romano was going to stand in a room full of the most powerful criminal figures on the eastern seaboard and present the destruction of the Moretti family as his greatest accomplishment. He had no idea that the woman he'd spent 8 years reducing to a variable had spent the last 42 hours doing the one thing he'd never once built a contingency for. She'd been listening. She'd been learning. And tomorrow night she was going to walk into his room. She did not sleep. There was no longer any point in pretending that sleep was a thing available to her, so she didn't try. She sat at the kitchen table in the estate with the 3 manila folders open in front of her, and a pot of coffee she kept refilling and her phone charging on the counter, and she worked through the hours between 2 and 6 in the morning, the way a surgeon works through a long procedure, not by ignoring the exhaustion, but by placing it in a separate room of the mind and closing the door on it, accepting that it would be waiting when everything else was finished. At 2:47 a.m., Adrian came downstairs. He didn't speak. He poured himself coffee, sat at the opposite end of the table, and opened his own phone. She could hear him on a call with Hoyle's Nightline, speaking in a low, precise voice. The lawyer's voice, she realized, not his operational one, the voice he used when accuracy mattered more than authority. He was telling Hoyle about Hadley House, about the summit, about the timeline. She listened with half her attention and kept reading the folders with the other half. At 3:15, Marcus called. The forensic review had been postponed. Hoyle had agreed to a 6-hour hold on the basis of new material being processed, which was the kind of prosecutorial flexibility that only happened when the new material was substantial enough to rewrite the shape of the case. At 4:30, Vivian arrived. She let herself in through the side door, Isabella had left it unlocked, and came to the kitchen without announcing herself, and sat at the table without being invited. And for approximately 90 seconds, the 3 of them occupied the same room with the specific compressed tension of people who had arrived at the same destination by different roads and were still absorbing the fact of each other's presence. Adrian looked at Vivian for a long moment. She looked back. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not accusation, but the flat, exhausted acknowledgement of 2 people who had been living inside the same elaborate lie and were too tired to perform anything about it anymore. The summit begins at 8 p.m., Vivian said. She set a folded paper on the table, a hand-drawn floor plan, detailed, with notations in her small, precise handwriting. Romano will speak at 9. He'll distribute the documentation, your signatures, at the beginning of the address, before any discussion, because he wants the weight of it in the room before he starts talking. He's done this before. He likes the room to be already committed before he explains what they've committed to. How many of his own people in the room? Isabella asked. 7, not counting the security detail. The detail is 6 men, Romano's personal team, not borrowed from the families. Vivian pointed to positions on the floor plan. They'll be stationed at these points. The 2 independent family heads, Marchetti and the Drummond representative, will be here and here. They don't know what the agenda actually is. They believe it's a standard alliance summit. Isabella studied the floor plan. Entry points. Romano controls the main entrance and the east service corridor. There's a west service corridor that connects to the kitchen. It's used for catering and isn't typically staffed by security during formal events because it's considered contained. Vivian paused. It can be accessed from the property's maintenance road, which isn't visible from the main gate. How do you know this? Because I've been inside Hadley House 4 times. Romano used it for planning sessions in the early months of the operation. Vivian's voice was flat. I memorized the layout. It seemed like the kind of information worth having. Adrian was looking at her with an expression that Isabella couldn't fully classify. Something between the residue of whatever he'd felt toward this woman and the new, colder understanding of what that feeling had actually been attached to. How long have you been building your own exit? He said. Vivian didn't look away. Since the 3rd year. Why didn't you? He stopped, restarted. There were moments. There were moments where you could have. I know, she said. I know there were. She looked down at the floor plan. I made choices I can't reconstruct the reasoning for anymore. I stayed inside it too long. That's the truth. The kitchen was quiet. Isabella looked at Adrian, at Vivian, at the floor plan with its careful notations. She thought about what Hoyle had said. Testimony is what makes it irreversible. She thought about Romano standing in a room full of the Eastern Seaboard's most powerful criminal figures, distributing Adrian's signatures, explaining 30 years of patient architecture as though he were reading from a document he was proud of. He's going to confess, she said. In that room tonight, he's going to explain everything he's built. He does it because he's certain there's no one in that room who can use it against him. She looked up. So we need to give him a room that looks exactly like the one he's expecting. The plan she built over the next 2 hours was not elegant. It had no elegant options left. Elegance required space and time, and she had neither, so she built something that was functional and direct, and that depended on a very small number of variables all behaving in the specific way she needed them to behave simultaneously. She outlined it to Hoyle at 6 a.m. in a call that lasted 11 minutes, and Hoyle was silent for the first 4 of those minutes, in the way of a prosecutor absorbing a proposal that is either brilliant or insane, and not yet certain which. If Romano's people identify the surveillance equipment before he speaks, Hoyle said finally. He won't check, Isabella said. He's been in that room 4 times with no surveillance. He controls the property. He controls the guest list. The only variable he hasn't accounted for is inside access, and he believes his inside access is completely loyal. Vivian. Yes. Another silence. Ms. Cross is a material witness in an active federal investigation. Using her as an operational asset in a live, she goes in as a guest, Isabella said, an invited guest of a family representative. She doesn't carry equipment. She doesn't make contact with your team. She is simply present, which she would have been regardless, because Romano expects her there. Hoyle was quiet for a long moment. And you? I'm the equipment handler, Isabella said. I go in through the west corridor with your technical team. I'm in the building before the event begins. I'm out before Romano finishes his opening remarks. That's not what you're actually planning, Hoyle said. A pause. No, Isabella admitted. Another silence, longer this time. What do you need from my office? 6 hours and a warrant ready to execute at 9:15 p.m. She heard Hoyle exhale. You'll have both. They left the estate at 4 p.m. in 2 cars, Adrian and Marcus in the first, Isabella and Vivian in the second, an arrangement that had not been discussed, and that happened naturally, the way things happen when the people involved are past the point of negotiating small logistics. Isabella drove. Vivian sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, and her face turned slightly toward the window, watching the city give way to the gray, flat countryside of the county roads. Neither of them spoke for the first 20 minutes. Then Vivian said, without turning from the window, I want you to know that I didn't intend for it to be the ring. Isabella kept her eyes on the road. You said that last night. I know. I'm saying it again because I want to say it in daylight. She paused. Romano told me to use something she can't replace. He'd been watching the household long enough to know about the lockbox. He knew what was in it. He directed me to it specifically. She paused again. I unlocked the box and I held it in my hand and I knew what it was, and I still... She stopped. I still did what I was directed to do. Isabella drove. The road ahead was straight, the fields on either side brown and still. Why are you telling me this? She said. Because you're going to have to decide at some point what you believe about intent versus action, about whether it matters that I knew it was wrong. Vivian's voice was quiet. I think it will matter to you, later. Isabella considered that for a moment. Later isn't tonight, she said. No, Vivian agreed. It isn't. They didn't speak again until the turnoff for Hadley House. The property was 300 acres of mid-county land that had been acquired through 4 layers of trust in 2009 and had existed in every official record as an agricultural holding with a residential structure. The residential structure was a fieldstone manor house that had been built in the 1890s and renovated extensively by someone who had both money and specific taste. Large windows, a wide front entrance, interior rooms that could be rearranged for different functions. The kind of house that had been designed for gatherings, for the particular social architecture of people who needed to convene in places where the walls couldn't be reached by the outside world. Hoyle's technical team had gone in through the maintenance road at 2 p.m., while Romano's security detail was concentrated at the main gate. They were professionals, not in suits, not in equipment that looked like equipment, dressed as maintenance contractors with a plausible work order for the HVAC system that no one on Romano's team thought to verify against the property management company, because the property management company also didn't exist in any form Romano had thought to check. Isabella came through the west corridor at 5:30 p.m. in a gray maintenance uniform with a canvas equipment bag that contained 3 wireless camera units the size of a deck of cards, presynced to a receiver in a surveillance van on the maintenance road, half a mile from the property line. She knew where she was going because she had the floor plan memorized. She'd spent 90 minutes with it that morning, tracing the corridors with her finger until the layout was as familiar as her own house. And she moved through the kitchen and the service hallway and the anteroom adjacent to the main gathering room with the specific unhurried purpose of a person who belongs in the space. The gathering room was large, high-ceilinged, with a long conference table and a presentation surface along the eastern wall. She placed the first camera unit above a sconce on the south wall, recessed behind the decorative ironwork. The second went into a ventilation housing above the presentation surface, angled toward the head of the table. The third she placed at the opposite end of the room, in the crown molding, which required standing on a chair she took from the room's corner and replaced exactly afterward. 11 minutes, total. She was back in the west corridor at 5:43, her heart at a pace that was elevated but not uncontrolled, her hands steady. She stood in the service hallway for a moment with her back against the stone wall and breathed. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, and listened to the building around her begin to fill with the sounds of an event assembling itself. She was supposed to leave. That was the plan. In, place the equipment, out through the maintenance road before the first guests arrived. She didn't leave. She told herself afterward that the decision had been made in that moment in the service hallway, but the truth was that it had been made earlier, maybe on the drive out, maybe at the kitchen table in the small hours, maybe in the study when she'd read the words, "Small things like that break people more reliably than large ones," and had felt the specific cold of a fury so complete it had passed through hot and come out the other side as something clear and permanent. She found a position in the anteroom adjacent to the gathering space, behind a door that was left open at a 30-degree angle, which gave her a narrow sight line to the head of the conference table. She settled in. She waited. The guests arrived between 7 and 8 p.m. She heard them before she saw them. The voices, the particular register of powerful men in a formal setting, social armor fully deployed. She caught fragments through the door, introductions, brief pleasantries, the careful small talk of people who were accustomed to rooms where what was said at the table was different from what was said before sitting down. At 8:45, she heard Romano's voice for the first time in person. It was exactly as it had been on the phone, measured, precise, with the specific authority of a man who had never had to raise his voice because the rooms he occupied had always been structured to ensure his words arrived intact. He moved through the greeting formalities with the ease of someone performing a familiar routine, and she heard in the warmth of his social voice the careful maintenance of a man who understood that being liked was an operational asset. At 9 p.m., the gathering room went quiet. She pressed her eye to the sightline through the open door. Romano stood at the head of the table. He was 73 years old in person and looked it in the specific way of men who have spent their lives in controlled environments, the skin fine, the posture deliberate, the overall impression of someone who had been very carefully preserved. He wore a dark suit and no tie, which was a choice, she understood, designed to convey something about the informality of what he was about to say. He looked, she thought, like someone who was about to enjoy himself. He began speaking. He began as Vivian had said he would, with the documentation. Copies were distributed by two of his men, moving around the table with the precision of a choreographed presentation. She watched the faces of the men at the table as they received the packets, some studied, some careful, two who looked at the material with the focused attention of people encountering it for the first time. Romano let them read for 3 minutes. Then he began to speak, and he spoke with the particular satisfaction of a man delivering a presentation he had been preparing for a very long time. He spoke about the Moretti organization, about its structural vulnerabilities, about the financial irregularities documented in the packets, the offshore transfers, the shell companies, the authorized signatures. He framed it not as exposure, but as legacy. The natural end of an organization that had been in decline for a generation, accelerated by its own leadership's choices. He was careful never to use the word manipulation. He was careful to present Adrian Moretti as an architect of his own destruction. He spoke for 11 minutes. At the 11-minute mark, when the presentation had reached its natural conclusion, the proposal for reorganization. Romano's network absorbing the Moretti territories, the assembled family heads asked to ratify a consolidation that had, as he presented it, already effectively occurred. He paused in the way of a speaker who is confident in his room. 30 years ago, he said, a man named Frank Caruso told me that there was no room in his world for the kind of cooperation I was proposing. He was wrong. He spent the rest of his short life being wrong. He looked around the table with an expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. His granddaughter, I'm told, has spent the past 2 days attempting to build a case against this consolidation using documentation she believed was her own discovery. He paused. She's a capable woman. I want that said, but she was working with material I gave her and she ran the play I designed for her and she doesn't know it yet. He looked at Vivian, who was seated at the table's south side. Vivian, he said, thank you for your service to this organization. You've been exemplary. Vivian looked back at him with an expression that was, to everyone in that room, simply neutral acknowledgement. She looked at Romano, and then she looked, for exactly 1 second, at the sconce on the south wall behind his right shoulder. He didn't follow her gaze. Isabella's phone vibrated against her palm. A text from the surveillance van. All 3 feeds live and clean. She texted back, copy. She remained where she was for the next 6 minutes, watching Romano complete his address. She watched him accept the ratification of the 5 family heads who were his, smooth, procedural. The raising of hands that ended a thing that had been building for 30 years. She watched the 2 independent heads, Marchetti and the Drummond representative, remain seated with their hands on the table and their expressions carefully unreadable, in the way of men who had not yet decided what to do with what they were witnessing. At 9:22 p.m., the front doors of Hadley House opened. She didn't hear it, she felt it. The specific change in the building's air pressure that happens when large exterior doors are opened from the outside, a breath of cold coming through the walls and the floor, the building inhaling. And then she heard the voices. The specific formal identification that preceded entry, the kind of announcement that happened when people with jurisdiction entered a space and needed the room to know it. She heard Romano's voice change, just slightly, just the first fractional degree of a shift from confidence to something that was not yet alarm but was its proximity. She stepped out of the anteroom. She walked into the gathering room through the side door and stood at the room's edge while Margaret Hoyle entered through the main door with 4 federal agents and 2 financial investigators who moved directly to the presentation materials at the head of the table with the practiced efficiency of people executing a prepared action. The room's reaction was not chaos. These were not men who expressed alarm as chaos. They were men who had survived decades of high-stakes situations by managing their responses. What happened in that room was a very controlled, very expensive silence. And into that silence, Margaret Hoyle spoke with the precision of someone who had been waiting a long time for this sentence. Vincent Romano, I have a warrant for your arrest on charges including racketeering, conspiracy, financial fraud, and the criminal facilitation of manipulation within a federal investigation. She paused. You have the right to remain silent. Romano did not look at Hoyle when she said this. He looked at Isabella. She was standing at the edge of the room in a gray maintenance uniform with a canvas bag at her feet and her hands at her sides. And she was looking back at him with an expression she had not planned and would not have been able to describe accurately, because it was not triumph and it was not anger, and it was not the satisfaction she might have expected. It was something quieter and more complete than any of those, the specific expression of a person who has done a hard thing to its end and is now standing in the moment after. Romano looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Vivian, then back at Isabella. Your grandfather, he said, would have been very proud. I know, she said. He was handcuffed at 9:26 p.m. He did not speak again. The next several hours were procedural in a way that felt, after everything that had preceded them, almost surreal in their ordinariness. The formal processing of arrests, the securing of documentation, the removal of Romano's security detail, the interviews that began in the room and continued in federal vehicles and would continue for weeks in formal settings with attorneys and transcripts. Hoyle moved through it with the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan. And the plan was good, and it held. Vivian was taken for a formal interview at 10 p.m. She went without being asked twice, without her attorney. She'd waived representation, which Hoyle had noted with visible surprise, and Vivian had explained with 3 words. I'm done performing. She would spend the next 4 months in a structured cooperation agreement that would eventually result in a reduced charge and a sentence that, given the totality of her cooperation, her attorney would later successfully argue down to time served and supervised release. It was not nothing. It was not justice in any clean sense. It was the complicated arithmetic of a system that values useful information over moral accounting, and Isabella had known from the beginning that this was what cooperation with that system produced. She didn't like it. She accepted it. Adrian was interviewed at the estate, not at Hadley House. Hoyle had agreed to this accommodation, and the interview lasted 6 hours and was followed by 2 more in the next 2 days. And at the end of the process, Margaret Hoyle had what she needed, and Adrian Moretti had a formal agreement for cooperation that came with significant conditions and 0 immunity for the financial irregularities that bore his signature, even those he hadn't knowingly authorized. He would spend the next year divesting from every operation that couldn't withstand federal scrutiny. He would lose holdings he'd spent a decade building. He would pay penalties that would have been catastrophic to a smaller organization and were merely very significant to his. Thomas Greer's sentence was reduced by 14 months. Ellis Carver moved back to the city in March and opened a small consulting practice in a building on Caldwell Street, 3 doors from Marcus Webb's second office. The 5 family heads who had ratified Romano's consolidation spent the following months in varying stages of federal legal jeopardy. 2 cooperated. 3 did not. The legal proceedings would take years and produce outcomes that ranged from significant prison sentences to acquittals that satisfied no one but were legally sound. This was how these things ended. Not cleanly, not with every thread resolved into a tidy bow, but with the slow, imperfect grinding of institutional process producing something that was closer to accountability than what had existed before. Vivian's fireproof cabinet and the 14 months of recorded communications on the USB drive became the evidentiary foundation of a RICO case that Margaret Hoyle would later describe, in an interview she gave after the trial concluded, as the most comprehensively documented conspiracy case her office had prosecuted in 20 years. She mentioned Isabella once, in that interview, without using her name. There was a woman who handed us the case and then handed us something we hadn't known we were missing. And I've been in this work long enough to know that doesn't happen often. February became March. March became a gray, reluctant spring that arrived in stages, the city not quite committing to warmth for several weeks before the trees along the estate's north drive finally decided the winter was finished. Isabella had stayed at the estate through all of it. She'd considered leaving, had, in the first 2 weeks after Hadley House, packed a bag twice and set it by the side door and then unpacked it again. Not from weakness, but from the recognition that leaving was a decision too. And she wasn't ready to make it from the middle of everything that was still in motion. When the dust was moving, you couldn't see what shape the ground underneath it was. When the dust settled, she looked at what remained. She was still married. She had not decided what that meant. Adrian did not press her. This was, she thought, possibly the most intelligent thing he'd done in the entire preceding 12 months. He had looked at the situation with the same cold operational clarity he applied to everything else and understood that any pushing would collapse whatever was still standing, so he did not push. He was present. He was honest in a way he had not historically been, with a consistency she attributed not to transformation, but to the specific condition of a man who had run out of useful alternatives to honesty and had discovered, in the absence of alternatives, that it was not as costly as he'd feared. He had also, in February, done something she hadn't asked for and hadn't expected. He had found her grandmother's ring, not retrieved, found. There had been a period during Vivian's cooperation process when the question of physical evidence had required accounting for certain items that had passed through her hands, and the ring had been documented and photographed and entered into a chain of custody and had eventually, after the relevant proceedings no longer required its retention, been returned to Isabella by a federal property clerk in a small manila envelope with a form to sign. She'd sat in the parking lot outside the federal building for 20 minutes, with the envelope in her lap before she opened it. The ring was exactly as it had always been, the thin gold band, the olive branches worn smooth at the points where her grandmother's fingers had worked against them for 6 decades. No different, undamaged, returned to her by the arithmetic of federal evidence procedure as if it had simply been temporarily misplaced. She'd put it in her coat pocket and driven home and placed it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. That night, Adrian came into the kitchen and saw it there, and he stopped in the doorway, and he looked at it, and then he looked at her, and he didn't say anything because there was nothing useful to say, which was the most honest response available, and they both knew it. She picked it up and put it in her pocket and went upstairs, and that was that. In April, she started taking long walks. Not therapeutic walks, not the kind that were prescribed or intentional. Just walking, in the mornings, through the residential streets north of the estate, where the houses had old trees and small gardens and a general quality of ordinary life being lived at its own pace. She walked for an hour, sometimes 2, and she thought about things, or she didn't think about things, and she came back and had coffee and did whatever the day required. On a Tuesday in mid-April, walking back along a street she didn't usually take, she passed a primary school at the moment the morning bell rang and watched children pour through the front doors into the yard. The noise of it, the particular unmanaged joy of children released into air after a morning inside. The way they ran toward nothing specific, ran simply because there was space to run in. She stood on the sidewalk outside the fence and watched them for approximately 3 minutes. Then she walked home. She told Adrian that evening. Not everything. She didn't enumerate the specifics, didn't explain the chain of thought from the schoolyard to the kitchen table. She just said it plainly, the way she'd originally intended to say it over lamb and Barolo in February, before everything had broken open. "I still want a family," she said. "I want that on the table. Not as a decision we're making tonight, just as something you know I want." He looked at her across the kitchen, and his face did the complicated thing it had been doing for months. The thing she was still learning to read in its current form, now that the masks were off and what was underneath was both better and worse than she'd expected. Less certain, more human. The face of a man who was not who she'd thought he was, and was also, in some ways she was still mapping, more than she'd thought he was, and she had not yet reached a verdict on what that added up to. "Okay," he said. "That's all." "Just okay?" "What else should I say?" She thought about it. "Nothing. Okay is enough." They ate dinner. It wasn't special. Something she'd made from what was in the house. Nothing prepared with intention, just food. They talked about ordinary things, the kind of things that had been crowded out for months by the weight of everything else. She asked about Marcus. He told her about a conversation he'd had with Ellis Carver about a legitimate business opportunity. A real estate development, nothing complicated, the kind of thing that would have seemed impossibly small 6 months ago and seemed now like the right size. She listened. She asked a question or two. She ate her dinner. She was washing the dishes when he came and stood beside her without being asked and picked up a dish towel and started drying. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't say anything about it. They worked side by side in the kitchen in the kind of silence that is not the absence of communication, but its own form of it. The silence of two people who have been through something together and are still in it, still working it out, still somewhere in the long territory between damage and recovered. She thought about what her grandmother had told her the week before she died. The women in our family do not run from fire. We learn to control it. She'd been thinking about it differently lately, not as a statement about endurance. She'd originally understood it that way, as a permission to withstand. But it wasn't about withstanding. It was about learning the fire itself, what it needed to burn, what it consumed, and what it left. The fact that after fire, some things were gone and some things remained. And the ones that remained were not the same as they'd been before, but were still there. And that was its own kind of information. She handed him a pot. He dried it. She washed another one. Outside, the April dark was coming in early, the way it did in the period between the last cold and the first real warmth. The night arriving before it was fully welcome, a little premature, a little assertive, but arriving regardless because that was what it did. She dried her hands on the dish towel and turned off the kitchen light. She stood for a moment in the threshold between the kitchen and the hallway, in the particular quiet of a house that was no longer the same house it had been in February and was not yet whatever it was going to become. She put her hand in her coat pocket. The ring was there. She took it out, held it on her palm in the dim light from the hallway, the gold band worn smooth by a life she'd never known in full, only in fragments. The stories, the face in old photographs, the feel of arthritic hands pressing hers in the last week of February 11 years ago, and the words, the specific compressed meaning of words spoken by someone who was finished with indirection. She put the ring on her right hand, not the left. She wasn't ready for that, and might never be. And she'd given herself permission not to decide. The right hand, where it sat with a slight looseness, the way things sit that were made for a different shape but are still yours. She walked upstairs. What happened afterward was not a single resolution, but a long, irregular unwinding of consequences. The kind of aftermath that doesn't have an ending so much as a gradual thinning, the events becoming less frequent and less violent until one day you realize that the emergency has passed and what you're living now is simply your life. Marcus Webb formally severed his legal relationship with the Moretti organization in May and established an independent practice. He was 71 years old and showed no particular intention of slowing down. Vincent Romano was convicted on 11 counts in November. He was sentenced to 32 years, which everyone involved understood to be a life sentence rendered in legal arithmetic. He made no statement at sentencing. He looked at no one in particular. He walked out of the courtroom with the posture of a man who has accepted a particular conclusion and is simply waiting for the last of the paperwork to be completed. Hadley House was seized by federal asset forfeiture and sat empty for 2 years before being purchased by a historic preservation organization and converted into a public museum of architectural history. The gathering room where Romano had presented his 30-year plan became an exhibit space. No one put a plaque in it. The Moretti organization contracted and formalized and redirected itself over the following 2 years in a way that was painful in some places and a relief in others. The legitimate holdings that could be separated from the criminal infrastructure were separated and continued. The hotels, the logistics company, the small regional bank in the Carolinas, which was eventually sold to a larger regional holding group for a price that was fair without being extraordinary. The people who had worked for wages in those enterprises kept their jobs, most of them, in the transition. This was the thing Isabella had asked for in the beginning, before she'd known what she was asking for, and it happened. And she did not make a ceremony of it because it was not the kind of thing that deserved ceremony. It was simply the right thing, finally done. On a morning in late October, Isabella sat at the kitchen table with coffee and a notepad and a pen. The notepad was new, Not the yellow legal pad from February, which she'd filled and filed in a box in the dressing room with the other documents from that winter, but a clean one, the first pages still smooth. She was thinking about what to do with the next chapter of her life, by which she meant not the next crisis or the next emergency, but the actual content of the years ahead. She was 38 years old and had been through something that had reorganized everything, and she was sitting at a kitchen table on an October morning with the sun coming through the east window and the smell of coffee and the quiet of a house that was not holding its breath anymore, and she was trying to decide what to want. Adrian came downstairs. She heard him before she saw him. The specific sound of him, which she knew by now in every register, morning and evening and the middle of the night, which she had been relearning over months in the way you relearn a language you spoke as a child and then forgot and are finding again in your adult mouth, different but recognizable. He came into the kitchen, poured coffee, sat across from her. He looked at the notepad. He didn't ask what she was doing. She looked up at him. "I'm going to start something," she said. "Something of my own, not connected to the organization, not the family name." She paused. "I don't know exactly what yet." He held her gaze. "What do you know?" She thought about it. "I know I want it to be something that helps people who don't have access to the kind of—" She stopped because the sentence was threatening to become large and abstract, and she didn't want large and abstract. She wanted the specific. There are people who got caught in the margins of the last 2 years. People who worked for organizations they didn't fully understand, who are now navigating legal and financial situations they can't afford counsel for. I want to build something that addresses that." He was quiet for a moment. "A foundation." "Something like that. I haven't figured out the structure yet." Marcus would know the right framework. "Yes." He looked at his coffee. Then he looked at her. "Can I help?" She considered that for a moment. Not the question itself, but what was underneath it, the register of it, the specific way he'd asked it. Not, "Let me handle it," not, "I have contacts." Just, "Can I help?" The smallest form of the offer, the form that left the answer entirely hers. "I'll let you know," she said. He nodded. He drank his coffee. He picked up his phone and looked at something and set it down again. And the morning continued in the ordinary way that mornings continue when there is nothing threatening them, nothing requiring the particular vigilance that had been the background frequency of her life for the past 8 months. She picked up her pen. She wrote at the top of the notepad's first page, in her own handwriting, not a name and not a plan, but a starting point. A single sentence that was not the beginning of a document, but the beginning of something she hadn't found the word for yet. "What do you do with what you survived?" She looked at it. Then she wrote underneath it, "You build something that couldn't have existed before it." She capped the pen. She picked up her coffee. Outside, the October morning was doing what October mornings did. The light at a low angle. The air with that specific crispness that was neither the cold of winter nor the warmth of anything else, just itself, the season transitioning through a moment that was entirely its own. The leaves on the drive's north trees had turned the week before, and the ground beneath them was layered in colors that were vivid and would be brief. And she looked at them through the window with the specific attention of a person who has been through a period of not being able to notice ordinary things and has recently recovered the capacity. She noticed them. The ring on her right hand caught the window light for a moment. A small flash of worn gold, the olive branches turned smooth by 63 years of living, and then by these months of being carried in a pocket and returned by a federal property clerk in a manila envelope and placed on the wrong hand by a woman who was still figuring out which hand was right. She turned her hand over, and the flash was gone, and the morning continued. The underworld would remember Adrian Moretti for years as the most feared of his generation, as the man who had dismantled his own empire and walked away, as the cautionary lesson that even the most controlled of structures could be entered from the inside and hollowed out without the exterior ever showing the damage until the whole thing was already done. The stories would be simplified in the retelling, as stories always were, until they bore the shape of a lesson rather than a life. But Isabella was not a story. She was a woman at a kitchen table on an October morning, with coffee and a notepad and a pen and a ring on the wrong hand and a husband who was learning, slowly, what honesty cost and what it was worth, and a future that had been so thoroughly dismantled and rebuilt that it no longer resembled what she had originally imagined for herself, which meant it was entirely her own. She opened the notepad to the second page. She began to write. End.